Hey guys. This is part 9 of What If Naruto Died and the Kyuubi Took Over His Body. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 46. The Die is Cast. March 15th, 348 NE. Kirigakure, Mizuki's residence. Private training ground. Itachi stared down at the custom tag in his hands, the almost inaudible hiss indicating that it was active and about to discharge its stored chakra in a single explosive burst. His Sharingan was activated and his eyes were whirling as he watched carefully, noting the small fluctuations within the seal as the chakra stored within shifted. When the chakra reached the triggering array in a progression that he had become intimately familiar with, the tag ruptured, filling the clearing with a storm of fire and smoke. The conflagration vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Itachi standing in the middle of a ring of scorched earth, his clothing and skin unmarred by the blast. He dropped the ashen remains of the tag and deactivated his Sharingan, nodding to himself in satisfaction. It was time to move on to the next step of his new technique. That is still disturbing to watch, he heard Mei say from the edge of the clearing. He turned, his eyes taking in her slim form appreciatively even as he noticed the tension in her frame. Too much tension, especially for something created by a scene she had witnessed many times before. I was informed that you had returned earlier, she continued, slowly walking towards him. I thought I might find you here. Itachi nodded, remaining silent as he continued to study her. I've been wanting to speak to you about a particular matter for some time, she said, her voice soft as she stopped just inches away from him and laid her hand gently on his cheek. Her hand was warm and soft, and he turned his head slightly into it. No. It was too warm. Before he could react, her hand closed around his throat and lifted him into the air, the heat stinging the skin on his neck even as the pressure slowly cut off his oxygen. His eyes activated immediately, the tomos spinning wildly and revealing the barely suppressed chakra roiling under her skin and etching the angry and betrayed look on her face into his memory. When I asked you about Konoha's Jinchuriki, she hissed, you swore that you had never seen information about him even when you were in NBU, that you had never even met him. So imagine my surprise when I find out that the Jinchuriki you knew nothing about was none other than Naruto Yamanaka, the child you trained for almost 2 years. You lied to me, Itachi. Did you think I would never find out? Or did you have some plan that would be accomplished before I knew? Is this all just some elaborate plot by Konoha to plant a spy in Kiri? Itachi stared down at her, saying nothing. After a moment, he deliberately shut off his Sharingan and looked into her eyes. Her surprise was evident, and her grip loosened for a moment. She drew in a deep breath, closing her own eyes and reining in her chakra. She then opened her eyes and dropped him, letting him land lightly on his feet. I want answers, Itachi, she said at length, her voice cold. If you can't do that to my satisfaction, you won't be leaving here alive. Itachi brought his hand up to his throat, the appendage glowing green as he healed the light burns on his skin. You will have your answers, but I ask that you allow me to explain without interruptions, he said calmly. Her brow twitched and her lips twisted into a light scowl, but she nodded. Technically speaking, I have not once lied to you. He held up his hand, interrupting her angry retort. What I have done is carefully chosen my words and twisted the truth in an attempt to. I suppose not choose would be the best way to put it. I have made it clear from the beginning that I retained contacts within Konoha, and that I viewed the village as a whole as neither an ally nor an enemy. While I kept certain information to myself, I could maintain my affiliation with those contacts while still operating more or less independently, a situation that I found personally ideal. My contact asked little of me and was pleased with the information I provided. He cared not who I chose to work with otherwise. I knew a time would come where I would have to choose, but until that time I was content to remain silent. What does this have to do with anything? Mei snapped, her patience clearly wearing thin. The very day I activated my Sharingan, I was told that a young boy named Naruto was the Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed beast. Many clans within Konoha were able to detect the beast's presence due to the unusual way the seal worked. I first encountered him shortly after he was adopted by the Yamanaka clan, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. My suspicion continued to grow over the years until one day I discovered the truth. Itachi eyed Mei, noting that her anger was slowly giving way to curiosity. He drew in a deep breath, preparing to set himself upon a path that could so easily lead to his ruin. The rewards if he could successfully navigate his way through the coming conflict, however, were worth the price. That truth, The information that I have never revealed to another, the information that only a handful of beings in the entire world know, he continued, his eyes boring into Mei's as he tried to convey how serious he was, is that Naruto Yamanaka does not exist. She narrowed her eyes at him, her anger rapidly returning. It would be wise to dispense with the word games, Itachi, she growled. I speak the literal truth, Mei, he said. The boy everyone knows as Naruto Yamanaka does not exist. He never has. What stands in his place is one of the most dangerous beings to ever walk the elemental nations, the nine-tailed beast. Mei stared at him, her eyes slowly widening and the blood draining from her face. That's impossible, she whispered. Nearly everyone would agree, which is a large part of the why he has been able to successfully hide his identity for so long, Itachi said, relaxing slightly as he realized Mei was truly listening to him. You need to understand something, Mei, he continued. This coming war between Konoha, Suna, and IWA, the war that you and Kyuubi are working to make a reality, is just a distraction designed to hide the ones truly responsible. That snapped Mei out of her shock. Then IWA really was framed? Was it Konoha and Suna after all? Itachi shook his head. An organization known as Akatsuki were the ones behind the attack on Taki. What village do they belong to? Mei asked, her eyes narrowed. And that is why all of the great villages have fallen into this trap, Itachi sighed. Akatsuki does not report to a village at all. Akatsuki in its entirety is made up of no more than 10 people, all S-class ninja. There is no way that 10 ninja, no matter how strong, could possibly challenge the might of one of the great villages. Not even Suna is that weak. If only Mei cut herself off, her eyes widening once more as her mind finally made the connections with what she was hearing. Because they have a Jinchuriki? Itachi finished, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. My sources tell me that Akatsuki controls 4. Akatsuki has enough power to topple any one of the villages, as they have already proven with Taki. Only a united front could seriously threaten them now. And what are the villages doing? Mei looked pained. Exactly. Turning on each other like jackals. Mei began chewing on her thumbnail as her eyes grew distant. We need to inform the other villages, she muttered. Begin planning how to counter them. Itachi shook his head. And tell them what? That a mysterious source told you it wasn't IWA after all? Or that I told you? Are you going to admit that you have sent missing Nin disguised as IWA Nin to harass Konoha and Suna's borders, and the reverse to IWA? That Kyuubi has done the same? It's too late for that, Mei. Gaara has already been deployed to Suna's borders, and he has skirted very close to entering IWA territory twice already. IWA will be forced to respond, and that Tsuchikage is too proud to back down now. He believes that Konoha and Suna are responsible, after all, and he has hated Konoha ever since the Third War. Mei was silent for a few minutes, her mind racing as she absorbed this new information. Finally, she looked up at Itachi, her eyes narrowed. Where does the nine-tailed beast fit into all of this? March 18th, 348 NE. Iwagakure, Tsuchikage's office. The tension in the room was thick, and none of the ninja present seemed willing to break the stifling silence. How many? The Tsuchikage repeated, his voice firm. The ninja standing directly in front of him swallowed thickly. 14, Tsuchikage-sama. The old man leaned back in his chair, hiding his wince as his bones shifted with practiced ease. His body was old. He was old. He had hoped to see his village once more standing at the top of the elemental nations before he passed on, but it was looking increasingly likely that his village would actually perish before he did. Were the attackers identified? The survivors sighted ninja wearing Suna and Konoha headbands. He ground his teeth for a moment, then swallowed his anger just as easily as he hid his pain. The other villages continued to insist that he was responsible for the destruction of that 2-bit backwater village, when in reality Taki was beneath his notice. Their only real asset was their Jinchuriki. Their vaunted defenses and hero's water had never truly been tested, and rumors had greatly exaggerated their efficacy over the years. Most ninja had grown up knowing that Taki was impenetrable, but he had been around long enough to remember when Taki was scrambling left and right, practically begging for missions. The other villages didn't care about that, though. No, they probably knew just as well as he did that IWA was not responsible. They were just taking advantage of the situation to try to finish him off once and for all. He had closed his borders to show them that he wasn't going to give in to their plans, but they kept pushing anyway, and now his village was dying by inches. Every day his borders were raided, and every day more of his ninja died. Suna and Konoha were biting at his heels, and Kyuubi and Kiri were just waiting in the wings, watching them fight amongst themselves and waiting to swoop in for the kill. He balled his hand into a fist and slammed it on his desk. I won't have it, he snarled. The ninja in the room flinched and shifted uneasily. His eyes shifted as one of the kunoichi stepped forward. Kuratsuchi, his granddaughter. She was very skilled, much like her mother. She would make a fine successor one day, but she wasn't ready yet. Won't have what, grandfather? She asked. The other villagers are trying to drag us down, waiting for us to show weakness. They want us to invite them inside our borders so that they can investigate. The moment we do that, they'll strike. Kuratsuchi shrugged. Tell me something I don't know, she muttered, running a hand through her short-cropped black hair. Impudent whelp, he snipped back, though inwardly he was pleased with her attitude. She wasn't afraid to state what she really thought to anyone, just as it should be. We can't afford to let them whittle us down any longer. Konoha and Suna have made us out to be the villains this time around, and they'll take advantage of that any way they can. They've already caused us a lot of problems with the neutral nations by getting them to close their borders to us. It's time we did something about it. Kuratsuchi's pupilless pink eyes widened in surprise. What are you talking about? Humph. What I'm talking about is striking when and where they least expect it. Suna has moved their Jinchuriki to the front lines, claiming that we have been raiding them. It's obvious they are positioning themselves for a full-scale invasion. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Konoha has moved their hidden Jinchuriki to the front lines as well. Well, yeah, Kuratsuchi replied, but we don't have a Jinchuriki to match them. It's one of their biggest advantages right now. Oanoki nodded, a dark smile on his face. And that's why we're going to even the odds. March 20th, 348 NE. Konoha, Hokage's office. Shikaku motioned the ANBU to leave and seal the room, his eyes focused on Inoichi. His friend was sitting in one of the chairs on the other side of his desk, a curious but relaxed expression on his face. What's up, Shika? Inoichi asked. Shikaku sighed, then stood and moved around the desk to take the seat next to Inoichi. As I'm sure you know, Shikaku began as he turned the chair to face Inoichi and dropped into it. The Hokage is privy to many secrets that are kept from the general populace for one reason or another. Some are just for security, but others are kept because the village can't know about them. Inoichi's expression grew solemn as he sensed the general direction this conversation was heading. I was informed of this particular secret, Shikaku continued, soon after I was named Sarutobi's successor. He himself had only known for a short time after he put together various clues on his own. Aside from Sarutobi and myself, only the ANBU commander knows. Inoichi frowned. Why am I being told then? Is it something that you need a Yamanaka for? I know I'm good, but I know of at least 2 Yamanaka who are in ANBU at the moment. 3, actually, Shikaku corrected absently, but that's not why. I'm telling you now because you are personally involved. I've delayed saying anything to you because I wasn't certain that no, Shikaku interrupted himself, grimacing, that's not why. I didn't tell you before now because it was the easy way out. Inoichi swallowed thickly. It wasn't like Shikaku to beat around the bush like this. Inoichi also knew enough about his friend to know that even now he was conflicted about what he was about to do. The tells were all there, the tension in his frame, the way he was rubbing his scar, the tightness around his eyes. If it's that big a deal, Shika, Inoichi said slowly. Shikaku grimaced then shook his head again. If it was anyone but you or Chuza, I might have kept my mouth shut. Sarutobi-sama certainly did, but that's proven to be a mistake. I don't know if this is the better path, but I swore to myself I would never lose sight of my friends, regardless of my title. Shikaku took another deep breath, then stared grimly at Inoichi. There's something you need to know about Naruto. March 21st, 348 NE, Yamanaka residence. Morning Tuchan, Ino yawned as she walked into the kitchen. She made her way to the refrigerator, idly noting that the coffee her father had made smelled particularly strong this morning. Another all-nighter? She asked sympathetically. Yeah, he replied dully, staring into his cup. That sucks, she offered as she began throwing together a quick and simple breakfast. She paused as she noticed that his right hand was heavily bandaged. What did you do to your hand? He didn't answer at first, his gaze shifting to stare at the gauze-wrapped appendage as if he'd never seen it before. After several seconds, his gaze flicked up to hers. Training accident, he said shortly. Was sparring with Shika and slipped up. Ouch, Ino winced. Want Naruto to look at it. He could fix it up in no time. There was an odd cracking sound, and coffee started dripping onto the table. Inoichi sighed and examined the cup, where a small crack ran along the side. He stood and moved to the sink, dumping the coffee out and setting the mug on the counter. That's all right, he replied to her earlier question. It's nothing serious, and it'll be a good reminder for me. If you say so, Ino said slowly, eyeing her father with concern. Is everything alright, Tu-chan? Everything's fine, honey, he replied as he grabbed a new mug and poured himself another cup of coffee, just a little wound up still. Speaking of Naruto, he added as he returned to the kitchen table, how has your secret training been going? Ino shrugged. Pretty slowly, actually. We haven't had a lot of time what with all the patrols we've been doing. I mean, yeah, we're awesome, but you think they'd cut us a break every now and then, she complained. It could be a lot worse, Inoichi pointed out. The casualties from the border raids have really dropped lately. IWA could be finally backing down, Ino hummed noncommittally. So, why don't you tell me what you're working on? Even if you don't have a lot of time to practice, maybe I could help out. Ino grinned and shook her finger at him. No way, she said, smirking. We're keeping this under wraps until we've got it right. When we finally show everyone what we can do, it's gonna be huge. Her dad laughed and held up his hands in surrender. Alright. You can't blame me for trying, though. You keep hinting about this amazing new technique. Of course I'm going to be curious. Still, he said, his expression softening, I also want to make sure you're safe. The higher rank the technique, the more dangerous it can be, especially if you don't have someone who already knows it helping you out. You guys are being careful, aren't you? Of course we are, Ino retorted, annoyed. And even if something does go wrong, which it hasn't and won't, Naruto is right there to fix me up. What am I fixing? Naruto asked as he walked into the kitchen, looking annoyingly fresh and alert, as he always did in the morning. He could at least pretend to have trouble waking up every now and then. Nothing, Ino said firmly, because nothing is going to go wrong. Ah, Naruto said as he settled down at the table. Dad's asking about our training again? Yep, Ino nodded, smirking. He'll just have to keep guessing. Naruto nodded, his eyes studying Inoichi's form. Want me to fix up your hand? He asked. That's alright, Inoichi replied, flexing it. It's not that bad anyway. Naruto studied him for a moment, then shrugged. They continued to talk as Ino and Naruto ate breakfast and Inoichi drank several more cups of coffee. Ino dumped her plate in the sink and checked the time. Hurry up, little brother, she teased. Hinata wanted us to help her practice her new jutsu, and if we take too long we won't have any time for our own training. Naruto nodded unhurriedly as he finished off the last of his meal and cleaned up his own mess. Whatever you say, Nei-chan. Ino frowned as she heard another cracking sound, then her dad bit off a curse as he dropped his mug and quickly wiped off his hand. Are you sure you're alright, Tu-chan? She asked worriedly. I'm fine, Ino, he answered distractedly as he picked up a rag and began cleaning up the spilled coffee. Just a little tired. Once I get some sleep I'll be good as new. If you say so, she replied. March 25th, 348 NE. Amigekure. Fu stared out over the city, the gloomy, overcast skies suiting her mood perfectly. Several months had passed since she had accepted the offer from the leader of Akatsuki to join their organization. In that time, she had gotten to know Jun and Kyoko, the two Jinchuriki who had destroyed Taki. Jun was, depending on who you asked, a cocky brat or a self-assured and assertive teenager. Fu was firmly of the former opinion. He was absolutely devoted to Akatsuki and its goals, and never missed an opportunity to praise his beloved leader Sama at every turn. He called himself a ninja, often bragging that he was one of the youngest ninja to ever achieve S rank, but he rarely used anything other than the chakra of the tailed beast sealed within him. In fact, the only time she ever seen him actually use techniques was when he was training with leader Sama. Kyoko, in contrast, was a very sweet and cheerful little girl that Fu couldn't help but like despite herself. She seemed to radiate happiness wherever she went, and even as she trained to become stronger she somehow managed to maintain a level of cuteness that Fu could not explain. Where Jun was devoted to leader Sama, Kyoko absolutely worshipped Angel Sama. Fu could understand that to an extent, as Akatsuki's second-in-command was vastly more approachable than the enigmatic leader Sama. A point in her favor was that she actually wanted people to use her name, Konan, as Fu had found out when the woman introduced herself, where Fu had yet to hear anyone refer to leader Sama as anything else. Konan was the only non-Jinchuriki member of Akatsuki that Fu had regular contact with. It was never outright stated, but it seemed clear to her that Konan was the one responsible for keeping the Jinchuriki in line. Of course, that might also have been because of Yahiko, the blue-haired boy who rounded out the group of Jinchuriki. Fu had to admit that seeing the son of the two leaders of Akatsuki as a Jinchuriki was a major point in their favor. If nothing else, it helped prove that they were serious about treating the Jinchuriki properly, and they were treating her well, she supposed, certainly better than Taki ever had. She was less comfortable around the other members of Akatsuki, the ones who were sent out on missions to do something, though she had no idea what it was. She'd been shocked to find that Kisame Hashigaki, one of the most famous missing nin in the elemental nations, had been a member of Akatsuki for years. She didn't talk to him much even on the rare occasions when he was in Amigakure, and he seemed perfectly content to ignore her in return. She got along much better with Deidara, the blonde missing nin from IWA who was obsessed with explosions. The fact that he could fly using that weird clay bird of his helped that along considerably. She'd heard about the religious fanatic Haiden, but Conan had warned her not to approach him if at all possible, and she had kept her distance, for which they had told her the same about the newest non-Jinchuriki member of Akatsuki. Orochimaru, the pale-skinned, golden-eyed missing nin from Konoha, always looked at her like she was some sort of specimen to be dissected. His words sounded reasonable and charming, but just being around him made her skin crawl. She honestly couldn't fathom how anyone else could stand to be around him. "Hiding up here again, are we?" a soft voice said from behind her. Foot turned to find Conan perched on the edge of the roof, her paper wings folded against her back. The blue-haired woman was wearing a dark blue cloak that shielded her from the perpetual rain. "I like high places," Fu replied, shrugging. "Kyoko was looking for you earlier, you know." "I'll find her later," Fu said. "I'd just like to have some time to myself sometimes." Conan nodded her understanding and then fell silent, both of them staring out over the village. "It's almost time for your next training session," she said eventually, "but we've got a few minutes to spare." "Shall we?" she asked, flaring her wings slightly. Fu felt a grin stretching across her face as the ever-present prodding inside her skull doubled in intensity. Her own chakra wings flared out of her back, and she launched herself off the side of the building, her hand tapping Conan's arm as she passed. "You're it!" she called out, laughing. Conan's own wings flared outward, just in time to catch one of the rare sunbeams that broke through the clouds and bathing her form in light. Fu's breath caught slightly as she took in the beautiful and majestic sight. Moments like this made it very clear why Conan was referred to as Angel-sama. Then the blue-haired woman took flight, rapidly closing the distance between them with a smile on her face, and the chase was on. March 31st, 348 NE. Soon as she border. "Another attack," Temari said quickly as her fan floated to the ground. Roughly 1 kilometer to the northwest. Gaara turned and immediately began moving in that direction, his relaxed manner at odds with the speed he was hurtling across the desert. Temari and Kankuro groaned in annoyance, and took off after him, Temari eschewing her fan in order to not draw any further attention to her team. They reached the location of the attack quickly to find that the Suna team was battered but otherwise intact and that the ambushers were already making a full retreat. Gaara didn't even spare the patrol a glance as he rushed past, a crazed smile growing on his face as he began the chase in earnest. "We'll get them!" Temari called out encouragingly, trying to reassure the patrol that they cared about their fate and that their injuries would be avenged. Kankuro nodded his agreement as they rushed past. One of the injured ninja gave them a quick thumbs up as they ran past, startling Temari enough that she almost stumbled. That certainly hadn't happened before. She didn't have time to ponder the oddly positive reaction though, as Gaara increased his speed and she had to focus on her own movements. They crossed over Suna's border with the Land of Stone almost immediately, but like with their other clashes with the raiders, they didn't stop there. This would make their 17th, maybe 18th chase, she thought. It was getting hard to keep track by this point. They'd only managed to catch half of their prey and had yet to actually capture any of them alive, and it wasn't Gaara's fault on that front, either. The ninja they chased resisted ferociously when cornered, and many ended up killing themselves with suicide techniques rather than surrender, while others were simply too difficult to subdue. If they had fought in the desert, Gaara may have been able to do more, but his control over dirt and stone required a great deal more focus, and he rarely had time to do so in the middle of a battle. On the upside, the skills of her entire team were growing by leaps and bounds. Kankuro was refining both his poison selection and puppetry techniques. She had never felt more connected with and in control of the wind, and Gaara was actually starting to move about and engage foes physically since he could no longer solely rely on his sand. And of course, with all the running they had done, none of them had been in better shape in their entire lives. She was still convinced Gaara was cheating somehow, though. He never seemed nearly as tired as she or Kankuro did, no matter how far they ran. "Something's not right," Temari heard Kankuro mutter to himself. "What?" she asked, moving closer to him. "The raiders are barely trying to shake us at all, just running almost in a straight line." "A straight line towards the land of Earth, no less," he added. Temari frowned, nodding. Kankuro did have a point, she noted. Usually their prey attempted to lose them by crossing over rivers, moving through thick forests or heavily populated villages, even creating clones to act as decoys. This group was focused purely on speed, and were managing to maintain their lead over Gaara despite the length of the chase. "I'm going up," Temari said finally, slinging her fan from her back, opening it, and hopping onto it in one smooth, practiced motion. A burst of wind chakra had her soaring upwards. From her new vantage point, she could make out the three ninja they were pursuing in the distance as they cut across an open field. They weren't even making a token attempt to hide their presence. Her eyes scanned the area in front of them, trying to make out anything unusual that might explain why their prey was acting in such an unusual way. She couldn't see anything, just thickets of trees and clusters of rocks, but then a flash of light caught her eye. One of the raiders they were chasing had pulled out something, a mirror, most likely, and was moving it back and forth. She was at just the right angle to catch the edge of the flash as it moved. She had already started flaring her chakra in a warning pattern before she was consciously aware of what that could mean. Ambush. Neither Gaara nor Kankuro slowed their pace, and she cursed as she realized she was too far away. She immediately angled downward, gaining speed and moving almost faster than she could control as she strained to reach them in time. Kankuro stumbled and jerked his head upward as he finally caught the signal, his painted face registering surprise and concern. Gaara, on the other hand, continued to move forward. "What is it?" Kankuro snapped quickly as Temari came close enough to hear him. "Ambush!" she shouted back, dismounting her fan and moving into a sprint. She'd be damned if she left Gaara alone to face a trap that was no doubt tailored for them. They were almost a kilometer behind, now, and straining to catch up as Gaara's pace increased even further. Then Gaara entered a small, open depression surrounded on all sides by clumps of trees and boulders. The massive surge of chakra almost bowled them over, even as far away as they were. In a single, coordinated strike, what must have been 50 ninjas stepped from cover and began launching ninjutsu of every description even as exploding tags buried in the depression went off, flinging dirt and rocks in every direction. Tornadoes of fire vied with animals formed from dirt and stone while bolts of lightning and blades of wind sliced into the area, all of them focused in the center where Gaara was last seen. To Temari's growing horror, the onslaught continued for nearly a minute, each and every ninja continuing to fling powerful jutsu into the depression without pause, before they all cut off at some prearranged signal. 3 of them had actually been injured by debris from the conflagration, and several more dropped to their knees, panting at the massive chakra drain on their reserves. Still others were watching the depression warily, waiting on confirmation that their attack had succeeded before they let down their guard. Someone had the presence of mind to use a wind jutsu to quickly clear out the dust, revealing a blasted, torn landscape. Temari felt her heart drop when she saw that there were no bubbles of stone or other structures that could have indicated that Gaara had managed to defend himself. One of the ninjas stepped forward, some sort of large animal at his side, and began carefully making his way to the center of the area. Temari felt someone grab her arm and pull her backwards. She ripped her arm out of their grip and spun around, a snarl on her face, only to find Kankuro staring at her, a pained expression on his face. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly. "Whether Gaara survived or not, there's nothing the 2 of us can do against that many. We'll have to trust that he can get away on his own." "You aren't going anywhere," a voice said from behind them. They spun, ready to defend themselves, to find 3 more ninja, all wearing IWA headbands and jounin flak vests, standing in front of them. "Orders didn't say anything about you 2 as long as we killed the little Jinchuriki shit, so you can surrender or we can kill you where you stand." "Got it!" one of the ninja from the ambush yelled. "Sealing team, stand by. The tailed beast is starting to reform." Temari felt like someone had just ripped her heart out through her stomach. Her eyes widened and tears spilled from her eyes unbidden. "No," she whispered. She could feel Kankuro trembling beside her, his killing intent spiking as his jaw clenched, and he stared hatefully at the 3 jounin standing before them. Then her eyes widened even further as Gaara emerged seamlessly and silently from the ground behind the jounin, a sadistic, delighted grin on his face. He spread his arms, the limbs stretching and growing until they formed large, clawed appendages that belonged to an animal rather than any sort of human being, then slammed them together. Temari barely managed to turn away to avoid the splash of blood and gore that erupted. "Gaara!" Kankuro exclaimed, relief clear in his voice. "Thank Kami, I thought they had gotten you." Gaara brought his finger to his lips. "Sure," he stage whispered, "let's not spoil the surprise." What?" Kankuro stuttered, shocked at the strange actions and tone from Gaara. That sound tugged at a distant memory in Temari's mind. She would swear she had heard a voice like that before, but she couldn't place it at that moment. Then Gaara collapsed into dirt. Chapter 47, The Tumbling Die. March 31st, 348 NE. Land of Stone, ambush site. "Get the fucking cube over here, you idiots!" The jounin snarled as he continued to draw the outline of the ceiling array. The two ninja carrying the cube just grunted, moving as quickly as they could while managing the weight of the object. Chakra metal was expensive. The process required that the initial material be almost entirely pure, and the work, both seal and manual, was long and arduous. The secrets behind its creation were guarded jealously, and the number of weapons and tools forged from it across the entire elemental nations was less than 100 per year. It was the mark of an extremely skilled, confident, and wealthy ninja if they possessed personal weapons forged from the material. The blades of the 7 swordsmen of the mist were rumored to be entirely or mostly forged of the metal, yet one more reason they were so highly sought after. The cube the two jounin were carrying was solid chakra metal and thus cost more than all of the ninja present could hope to make in a year, combined. It had been used by IWA for decades to safely contain and transfer its tailed beasts whenever a Jinchuriki became unable to continue carrying their burden. They placed the metal cube in the middle of the circle and stepped back. The seal master immediately began slapping prepared seals all over its surface. He also sliced his thumb and began spreading his blood directly on the metal, connecting the seals in complex patterns. The other ninja, their job mostly done, watched him work warily as they kept their eyes open for any sign of the beast that would shortly be unleashed. It was well known that the tailed beasts were immortal and that killing a Jinchuriki would release the one sealed within them. That fact served to make the containers, already an incredibly dangerous foe, even more so. Even if you managed to kill one, you then had to contend with the beast sealed within them. IWA had not set upon this course lightly, however, and they were prepared. Not only would they deprive Suna of their Jinchuriki, but they would also gain one to replace the 2 they had lost. In time, they would even be able to turn their newest Jinchuriki against Suna, the one-tailed beast's control over sand, serving to doom the village rather than defend it. Hurry it up! Another jounin snarled worriedly. The concentration is growing rapidly. I'm almost done! The seal master snapped. His hands began moving even faster as he shuffled around the cube. After placing the last few seals and wiping blood across the metal, he leapt back and settled onto the ground, sitting cross-legged at the outer edge of the circle. His hands were blurring through signs, small droplets of blood flinging off of them as they rapidly shifted. Drawing in one last deep breath, he clapped his hands together, and then slammed them onto the circle, calling out, "Sealing art, Earth's eternal prison." The other ninja began to relax as the seal master finished his work. Once the beast was completely contained, they would hurry back to IWA where it would be transferred into a suitable living host. "Hey," one of the ninja called out quietly, "nothing's happening." The dissipating tension flooded back into the scorched and broken crater. "What's wrong? Did the seal not work?" The seal master didn't answer, remaining motionless with his hands firmly planted on the ground. "Fucking answer me, damn it! Is the thing sealed or not?" The seal master didn't move, his gaze remaining focused on his hands. The ninja began shifting warily, the sense that something wasn't right pressing down on them. The closest jounin walked over to the seal master, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him roughly. The seal master's head lolled back and forth loosely before his body seemed to explode, spikes of earth lancing out and impaling the jounin who had shaken him. Then the earth started trembling. "What was that?" Kankuro asked, stepping backwards in surprise. "What just happened?" "I don't know," Tamari said quietly, "but I don't think that was Gaara." Kankuro turned to her in confusion, but they stopped talking when the earth under their feet began shaking. It started softly but rapidly grew in strength until, with a tremendous heave, it felt like the very ground beneath them dropped away. They fell to their hands and knees, landing harshly against the bucking earth as it seemingly rose to meet them. The tremors subsided after that, and Temari looked over to Kankuro. "You okay?" she asked, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring towards the ambush site, his mouth gaping open and his skin visibly paling, even hidden as it was by his face paint. She turned to look, and her own mouth dropped open even as she felt the ground shaking under the force of an enormous impact, and a loud booming sound washed over them. She watched in awe as an enormous thing rose out of the earth, the shifting dirt and stone giving the impression of rippling muscles as it seemed to pull itself upwards using two pillars of twisted stone that served as its legs. As she looked on, more pieces of the thing fell away to reveal two hind legs, the appendages bending backwards at the knee and ending in clawed feet like an animal's. Another appendage emerged, lashing out behind the thing horizontally, revealing itself to be a long tail. The thing must have been at least 30 feet tall and easily twice as long, even without counting the tail. Then it turned its head, revealing its canine-like muzzle and its dark yellow, almost golden eyes which had black, diamond-shaped pupils. The thing raised its right foreleg and slammed it back into the ground, causing the earth to buck beneath them once again. Temari managed to tear her eyes away from the tailed beast. It had to be, though she felt her gut clenching as she thought about what that meant for Gaara, long enough to see the gouts of flame and sparks of lightning that were assailing its form. From this distance and compared to its size, it was almost like watching fireflies dance around it. Its tail whipped around, creating a long, rolling boom as it moved through the air, then a bone-rattling crash as it impacted against the earth. The ground seemed to roil for a moment before a large wall sprang up, running for hundreds of feet to the north, then curving around. The thing repeated the motion in the other direction, creating a large half-bowl with tall walls of dirt and stone on one end and itself on the other. Its face shifted, and Temari would swear that the beast was grinning. "It's playing with them," Kankuro suddenly gasped. "Kami, it's how can it?" Temari swallowed nervously as she realized what Kankuro was talking about. She could just make out the ninjas scrambling desperately to escape the beast, but they slipped and fell as they tried to use their chakra to climb the walls the beast had created, and she could see a few slamming their hands into the ground only for nothing to happen. A bright flash of light suddenly appeared, and Temari rapidly blinked her eyes in an attempt to clear her vision. Through the spots in her eyes she could see a large chunk of one of the beast's legs was missing, but even as she watched it began to reform. She couldn't tell that the beast even felt the attack, and despite the visible damage caused, it didn't seem to actually hinder it in any way. The beast suddenly lunged forward, its towering form moving shockingly fast as its claws pierced through several ninja. That seemed to break the last of the resistance among the IWA Nin, as the attempts to attack the beast ceased and all of them simply began running in any direction they could. This seemed to delight the beast even more, as its grin grew even wider as it swatted its claws back and forth, each movement ending the life of another ninja. Temari thought some of the IWA Nin might get away since they were fleeing in opposite directions, but the beast's tail suddenly lifted into the air before plunging into the earth. To her growing horror, a ring of spikes began blossoming out of the earth, spreading in every direction and impaling the ninja attempting to flee. Her horror was not due to the death of the IWA Nin, though they deserved all of that and more for what they had done to Gaara, but because the spikes weren't stopping. She and Kankuro scrambled to their feet, pushing as hard as they could to gain distance even as she hefted her fan and prepared to take to the skies. She couldn't maintain flight with two people for very long, but if they didn't get off the ground now, the grinding sound of the spikes rapidly grew closer and closer even as she channeled her chakra into her fan. Then, just before she would have leapt onto the fan, pulling Kankuro with her, the sound abruptly stopped. Temari stumbled at the sudden change, almost falling to the ground. Her descent was prevented as Kankuro steadied her, his expression grim as he looked back towards the tailed beast. The towering monstrosity was breaking apart, chunks of rock and dirt tumbling to the earth as it collapsed. Its yellow eyes appeared to be closed, and it almost looked like it was simply lying down for a nap as it settled to the ground. "Ah, I needed that," came a satisfied sigh from behind them. They spun around to find the Gaara look-alike standing there, rolling his shoulders as if stretching after some strenuous activity. He had a lazy smirk plastered on his face, but it was his golden, slitted eyes that Temari focused on. Those were the same eyes the beast had. "What are you? What happened to Gaara?" she snarled, raising her fan threateningly. Some part of her questioned the wisdom of threatening the thing that had just done that to 50 IWA Nin, but she knew that if it wanted them dead they would already be dead. "Gaara is fine, though he might be a little sore. That was a lot more than he's ever handled before. As for me, well, I think you've figured that out by now, He raised one hand, cutting off their reply. "I'm sure we'll meet again, but for now, good day," he finished, the smirk turning into a grin. The yellow eyes closed, then his form suddenly turned brown before pitching forward. It landed on the ground with a soft thud, releasing a small cloud of dust. Temari and Kankuro looked at the mound of dirt, then at each other, both wondering where Gaara was. Was he back at the center of the crater? A low groan from the dirt caused them to jump in surprise, before they rushed forward and pulled their younger brother out of the pile, brushing the loose dirt off of his form. He looked up at them with his green eyes, causing both of them to sigh in relief. Temari engulfed her brother in a hug and Kankuro clapped a hand on his shoulder a moment later. "I'm so glad you're okay," she said. "I thought." Gaara slowly returned the embrace, one hand patting her shoulder awkwardly. "I'm fine," he said. "What was that?" Kankuro asked. Gaara's expression grew distant for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "There's something you should know. April 4th, 348 NE, Konoha, Council Chambers. It is the unanimous decision of this council that Konoha is henceforth in a state of war with the Wabakure no Sato. All non-essential operations are hereby suspended, all field agents are to be recalled, and all of our allies are to be notified. The Hokage shall assume his full wartime authority until such time that the conflict has been resolved. Shibi Aburame concluded, fulfilling his traditional duty as the Jounin commander to function as the arbiter for any council meetings. Shikaku rose, his expression tired but firm. Suna has already begun mobilizing, and the daimyo has agreed to temporarily suspend our internal security duties within the Land of Fire. With the exception of the 12 ninja guardians, he has returned all of the ninja under his command to us. Kiri and Kumo have both agreed to provide 4 squads, and Kiri has gone one step further and is sending Zabuza Momochi as their commander. Your pardon, Hokage-sama, but even with the addition of Momochi-san, such small numbers are hardly going to make a significant difference, one of the counselors pointed out. In terms of our overall strength, Matsuno-san, you are correct, Shikaku replied, nodding. However, those squads are ninjutsu specialists that will give us some additional tactical options if used properly. Aside from that, the gesture is largely political, meant as a show of solidarity. They are making their position in this conflict clear both to ourselves and to any observers. They are also providing limited logistical support in the form of weapons and other supplies. The counselor nodded, accepting the explanation. The squads from Kiri and Kumo should be arriving within the week, and Suna will begin moving a few days after that. We will cross into IWA territory in 2 weeks. Our battle plan calls for a series of coordinated strikes as we occupy or destroy key strategic positions within IWA. Our expectation is that IWA will employ hit and run tactics to combat our approach, attempting to weaken us and offering only token resistance until we reach Iwagakure itself. Shikaku glanced to the side for a moment, then nodded. I will now defer to the field commander. The attention in the room shifted to the man sitting to the Hokage's right. IWA enjoys 3 significant defensive advantages. First, the barren and flat landscape provides little cover for any approaching hostiles. Second, their mastery over earth jutsu is well suited to the terrain. And third, the village itself is protected by one of the most advanced barrier jutsu ever developed, powered in part by the Tsuchikage's dust release. To counter the first, the Kiri and Kumo squads will be using their village's techniques to provide wide-scale mist and storm cover. Any ninja deployed to the front lines will be required to demonstrate adequate skill in operating under these conditions. To counter the second, each squad deployed in the field will have at least one ninja capable of employing lightning techniques, and all ninja will receive briefings on common earth techniques and their counters, in particular the rock crusher jutsu. To counter the third, we have 3 independent strategies. The first is for Jiraiya to create a sealing array capable of neutralizing the barrier, or at least reducing its effectiveness. I will be lending my own knowledge and expertise to his efforts. The second is to overwhelm the barrier by having large numbers of techniques focused onto specific areas. The room shifted uncomfortably. While that approach was likely to be effective, it could also easily backfire if IWA was prepared to counterattack the weakened ninja. The third option is for Suna and Konoha to deploy our Jinchuriki. There was a hiss as several ninjas sucked in their breath, and no one spoke for several seconds. Sim was the one who finally broke the silence. Sandame-sama, after the recent assassination attempt, we know Gaara is capable of manifesting his beast form to great effect, but surely our Jinchuriki's particular issues. She trailed off, glancing sideways at Inoichi and wondering why he wasn't reacting more to the former Hokage's declaration. Perhaps he already knew. Sarutobi's face could have been carved from stone as he replied. Despite our Jinchuriki's unique situation, we have every reason to believe he will be just as effective as Gaara in this endeavor, if not more so. Sim nodded uncertainly, not willing to push the matter any further. April 7th, 348 NE, Hokage's office. Shikaku didn't react as the door to his office slammed open. He was confident that his ANB would have prevented all but a select few from taking even that much liberty with their Hokage and his privacy. His eyes did narrow in worry as Inoichi barged in, a sheaf of papers clutched in one hand. Ichi, what's? Seal up the room, then read it, Inoichi interrupted, slapping some of the papers on the desk and collapsing into a chair. Shikaku eyed his friend for a moment before signaling his ANBU to leave the room. Once they had left, he turned his attention to the documents. Session 1078-999-21, January 17th, 339 NE. Counselor, redacted. Patient, redacted. Begin transcript. Ichi, what is this? Shikaku asked, flipping through the papers. There were 5 in all, starting with the 21st session and ending with one dated November of 346. Inoichi just shook his head. I've highlighted the relevant sections. Just read it. Shikaku nodded slowly, his eyes scanning until he found what Inoichi wanted him to read. Counselor, what do you think his punishment should have been? Patient, execution. Counselor, that is an unusually strong punishment. Normally such crimes are resolved with fines and possibly jail time for the guilty and restitution for the victims. Patient, he abandoned his family, stole everything from them. If he is willing to do that, then is there anyone he would not betray, anything he would not take? Such a man is a danger to everyone around him, and should be dealt with accordingly. He moved to the next document, dated May of that year. Counselor, so you feel that, in principle, duty to the village supersedes all other obligations for a ninja, but make exceptions for family? Patient, in essence yes. Counselor, could you explain your reasoning? Patient, the village is ideally a sort of extended family, but such a broad definition would require you to care for and defend a perfect stranger as if they were your family. Pretty words, but impossible and undesirable in practice. Instead, there are levels of commitment, ranging all the way from family to perfect strangers and even to enemies, and the sum of those groups is the village. Counselor, do you feel that you have enemies within the village? Patient, not me specifically, no. My meaning is that in fulfilling their duty to the village, the ninja is protecting all of those groups equally. Anyone would be willing to protect their enemies if it also meant protecting their family. The inverse, however, to destroy your family if it meant destroying your enemies, will almost never hold true. In that case, I believe that any ninja would prioritize their family over the village as a whole. I would not trust anyone who would answer otherwise. The next was dated 2 weeks later. Patient, thinks I'll have mastered the technique soon. Redacted, also mentioned that you had gone to see her about, redacted, training. Counselor, I did, yes. I'm a little concerned about how hard she had been pushing herself. Patient, she is merely trying to become as strong as she can. Is that not a good thing? Counselor, it is, but only if she isn't hurting herself in doing so. Patient, but pain isn't unavoidable. Counselor, I didn't mean in the temporary discomfort sense. I meant in terms of damaging her long-term potential by pushing too hard too early. Patient, that is possible? Counselor, for most people, yes. In, redacted, not recover from such injuries. Patient, I see. The next was dated October 342 NE. Shikaku noted that Inoichi had scrawled the word bloodlines in the margin. Counselor, have made surprisingly fast progress. I don't think, redacted, expected them to pick the, redacted, up so quickly, and redacted, has been doing well too. Patient, is that not how, redacted work? Counselor, well, in the case of the, redacted, and redacted perhaps. Others have to work long and hard in order to acquire those kinds of techniques. And I don't think they have, redacted anyway, just, redacted. You seem confused. Patient, I suppose I don't understand the distinction between an affinity for, redacted, and a full-blown, redacted. Is redacted not picking up the, redacted, faster than you had thought possible? Counselor, she is doing very well, yes, but that doesn't mean that, redacted. Patient, if you say so, but I think she will surprise you. The last was fairly short. Counselor, so how does it feel to have, redacted, on your team? Patient, good, of course, but I knew they wouldn't separate us. Redacted, wouldn't do that. Counselor, there could have been compelling reasons to do so. Not everyone is placed with the team they want. Patient, perhaps not, but there was no way, redacted, would be placed on another team. Neither of us would accept that. There are others, of course, but those are the ones where it's the most obvious, Inoichi said when Shikaku looked up. I assume these are records of your sessions with Kushu, but I'm not sure I understand what I'm supposed to get from this. I've had sessions with him for years, over 300 and counting. Despite his success in hiding the fact that he was the tailed beast, he could not possibly have faked his entire personality without any flaws or contradictions for so long. Based on what you have told me, many core pieces of Naruto's personality are maintained even when he is acting as Kushu. Some are emphasized, others minimized, but they are still there. And I went back over my notes and transcripts, looking for anything that could give us an advantage or some understanding of his motivations. Oddly enough, it wasn't until I read over the Sandame's description of their first meeting that everything started falling into place. Shikaku leaned forward. The Sandame described how Kushu seemed to enjoy turning his own words against him, even directly quoting him in his replies to further mock him. He also mentioned that, as much as he could determine, the descriptions Kushu gave of his history with the summons were factually accurate but also misleading as well. This matches with his behavior when joking with or pranking the clan kids, especially Kiba. Once I had realized that, I recalled something that Hayashi had mentioned. It was shortly after Kushu lost his arm in the battle with the Yandame, when he returned to the emergency shelter. He said, quote, "Death does not scare me. What does scare me is a threat to my family." Shikaku leaned back, his eyes dropping to the documents in front of him again. We have every reason to believe that he is effectively immortal, so his comment about death is, again, factually accurate but misleading. Hayashi believed he was referring to my family with the rest of his statement, whereas he actually meant the other bijou, Shikaka noted wryly. Accurate, but misleading, and no doubt amusing for him. Inoichi sucked in a deep breath, then let it out slowly. Yes and no. Shikaka's eyes snapped to his. What do you mean? Inoichi's expression was pained as he continued. Hayashi mentioned something else to me about that day. He told me that Ino didn't seem concerned about the loss of Naruto's arm, and that she felt that he was essentially invincible because of his advanced healing capabilities. He wanted to let me know so that I could convince her otherwise without requiring drastic measures, especially since he actually did manage to recover from the loss of his arm. Shikaka felt a sick feeling settle into his stomach. It seemed that his worst-case scenario was true after all. He had hoped Inoichi would manage to find a different explanation. Ichi, he said quietly, Ino used to worry about him, you know? Even after the incident with Miyazaki, she would overreact every time he got so much as a paper cut. She almost broke down when Itachi tried to kill him and he was in the hospital for so long. Then, at some point, she just stopped. At some point he changed from vulnerable to invincible, to the point that she had absolute confidence that losing his arm was nothing but an inconvenience. Inoichi looked down at his hands. My little girl knows Shika. She's known for years because he told her. And Kami helped me. I think when he's talking about family he's also talking about her. I suspected some of that, Shikaka said at length, but I had nothing in the way of definitive proof and certainly nothing to suggest that Ino knew everything. He sighed. This entire conversation was troublesome beyond all reason. You know that secret training that they've been doing? Inoichi nodded. It's been happening in the Namikaze compound. Inoichi's eyes slowly widened. You mean, it's quite possible that both of them have been learning to use the Hiraishin, not to mention the possible sealing knowledge that Kushu now has at his disposal. He already knows the Rasengan, as Jiraiya taught him that before the Chunin exams. Inoichi looked torn between concern and pride. The room lapsed into silence as both considered the knowledge they had gained. After a few minutes, Shikaka's eyes shifted to the other paper still clutched in Inoichi's hand. Was there something else you found? Inoichi looked confused for a moment before he glanced down at the document. Oh. Yeah, there was something else. I think I've figured out why no one ever managed to catch him doing anything strange or unusual, he said, placing the record in front of Shikaku. This one was dated shortly after the disastrous Chunin exams last year. Inoichi had circled 4 lines several times and underlined certain words for further emphasis. Gara was written along the margin. Counselor, so you decided to investigate when you felt that odd sensation? Patient, yes. I'd never encountered anything like that before and wanted to know what it was. Counselor, and when found the source of that sensation? Patient, it was redacted. I didn't know what he was at first, but I could tell there was something different about him. Shikaku read it through 3 times as his mind recalled the details of that incident. He was eating lunch at Ichiraku's when he abruptly left the stand and ran towards the gate, Inoichi added, where he met Team Baki. From the stand to the gate is at least 4 kilometers. Nobody paid much attention to that with everything else that was going on at the time. Troublesome, Shikaka muttered, looking up at his friend. A lot of the oddities and unusual patterns in his movements suddenly made a lot more sense. He's a censor. I think all of the bijou are. It should have been obvious, really, they are just chakra. I don't think anyone has really thought through the implications of that until now, especially since they assume forms that have normal sensory organs. Shikaku just nodded even as his mind began sorting through their plans on dealing with Kushu and the other bijou and Jinchuriki. Some of them would be completely worthless now, but others were salvageable. They would have to assume they could never take any of them completely by surprise, however. At best they could lure them into an area where they thought they were around friendly ninja. What are you going to do about Ino? Inoichi asked, interrupting his thoughts. Shikaku sighed and leaned back in his chair. We must assume that her loyalty to the village is compromised, he said, causing Inoichi to flinch. However, given Kushu's emphasis on family and her own personality, I do not believe that she would consciously work to harm you or other people she cares for, even if she is willing to keep his secrets. Inoichi relaxed marginally, relief showing through. And ultimately, she is not in possession of any knowledge or authority beyond that of Kushu himself, and so does not present a security risk in that regard. She is skilled in your clan's techniques, but our routine checks for tampering have not shown that she has actually used them against anyone within Konoha. As long as we assume that anything Ino knows she will tell Kushu, I do not think any overt action is required. We will have to maintain a watch on her to track her movements, however. Inoichi frowned but nodded. I understand, he said. Thank you. Are you planning to confront either of them? Shikaka asked quietly. Inoichi hesitated, but eventually shook his head. Not immediately, he said. This whole situation is too raw right now. I'm barely managing to keep it together when they're inside the house. I think with time and a better understanding of Kush's goals, I should be able to approach this situation constructively. Part of me hates him, you know? He confessed. Like a lot of other people, I've hated the nine-tailed beast ever since it attacked. Self-defense or not, he killed so many ninja that day and he doesn't even care. It's just not relevant to him. He deceived us for so long, pretending to be Naruto, and knowing that he was just sitting there, watching and laughing as I tried to help him during our therapy sessions. His hands clenched into fists, then relaxed. But part of me also remembers that he saved Ino's life, kept her from pushing herself too hard when she was training, became her best friend and has always stood by her and supported her. I've thought of him as my own son, and was every bit as proud of his accomplishments as I was of Ino's. He looked back at Shikaku, an utterly lost expression on his face that made the Hokage's heart clench in sympathy. How am I supposed to reconcile that? April 10th, 348 NE, Namikaze estate. Everything's happening so fast now, Kusha heard Ino murmur lowly as she leaned against him. They had finally found a chance to make it back to the Namikaze estate for more practice, but Ino found that she couldn't concentrate on her training. They had ended up just sitting against the wall, Ino staring blankly across the room as she drew comfort from his presence. It is, Kushu agreed. He had wondered when this moment would come. Ino had needed little convincing to follow Konori's plan, but there had been moments where he could see her doubts and fears. In some ways he wished she had reached this point earlier, and in others he was impressed that she had lasted this long. It's just, so many people are going to be fighting soon, fighting and dying. And they don't even know what they're fighting for. They're fighting for their friends and family, just like we are, Kushu replied. But they're going to be attacking IWA, and they didn't really do anything. It would be so much better if they all just focused on Akatsuki. It would be, but the circumstances were all wrong. There was so little evidence to point to Akatsuki, and more than enough to muddy the waters of any potential alliance. IWA and Konoha would never work together, and might even support Akatsuki against the other if it came to that. Kumo and Kiri probably wouldn't have taken part at all, and Kumo certainly wouldn't field their Jinchuriki. Once this war has played out, Akatsuki will find themselves with nowhere to flee and no allies to protect them. All of the villages will be focused on them as the masterminds behind this war, ensuring that they receive no support from the surviving powers in the elemental nations. With all of the villages focused upon them as the enemy, they will be worn down, split apart, and broken. From there it will be a trivial matter for us to locate the rest of our brethren and free them. But, don't forget our ultimate goal, Nei-chan, Kusha said chidingly. No one will be allowed to keep us captive. I know, she replied, deflating slightly. It's just, Dad's going to be out there, you know? And Shikakujiji, and Chuzujiji too. Hinata's been assigned to one of the forward scouting teams, Team Mikoto is patrolling around the command center, and Team Kurenai is guarding the supply lines. They've put me on the short-range scouting squads, and you are going to end up on the front lines sooner or later. She shook her head. Even if everything goes well, people are going to die. I'm worried it's going to be someone I know. Kushu tightened his arm around her, squeezing her shoulders lightly. He didn't like that they were being assigned to different areas of the battlefield, but he would be in the thick of the fighting and unable to respond quickly should Ino find herself in trouble. She wasn't completely out of danger, but she wouldn't be on the front lines and would likely only face limited fighting against weaker opponents. She was progressing well, but she wasn't quite ready yet. Even if that does happen, he said finally, responding to her concerns, it would have been much worse otherwise. Just imagine what would have happened if they'd gone after Akatsuki directly only for IWA to betray them and launch a surprise attack. Akatsuki doesn't have the resources to do the same, and they've been very, very careful about risking their members so far. Ino blanched, then nodded slowly. I can't say nothing bad will happen, but Inoichi and the others are ninja. They've been preparing for this sort of thing all of their lives. Ino sighed. I just wish, I know. They've brought this upon themselves, however. All of them wanted our power, and now they are facing someone who has it, and is actually willing to use it against them. Without our assistance, oblique though it is, they would be in a far worse position. Once Akatsuki has been completely destroyed, we will be more than willing to just leave the villages alone if they'll do the same for us. But enough of that, he said abruptly, standing up and pulling Ino with him. It's time to resume your training. He maneuvered her to the center of the room, and then dropped to a seated position. Ino looked down at him, and then nodded, taking a seat across from him and settling into a meditative pose. "You've been doing fairly well so far, but you've still got a long way to go. I want you to be able to handle twice what you can now by the time we leave for IWA, Ino grimaced. Easy for you to say, she muttered. You've been dealing with Yuki all of your life. Less bitching, more training, he replied, smirking. She grumbled but closed her eyes, her face slowly losing all emotion as she focused. Kushu watched her for a moment as Yuki filtered out of his body to form tails that hovered around them both. Once he felt she was ready, the tails moved around Ino, surrounding her and beginning to permeate her body. He continued adding more and more energy until the air around her was completely saturated, then sat back and watched. Nothing seemed to happen at first, other than the occasional twitch or grimace from Ino. Slowly though, the Yuki began to move back and forth, shifting around her in simple patterns. Though she was getting better and faster at this exercise, he was far more interested in what was happening deep within her chakra coils. Even as he watched, the energy her body produced began to darken, shifting from sky blue to a deep navy. He slowly began withdrawing his Yuki, eventually leaving all of it in the shell around her body. Her chakra didn't lighten though. Instead it rapidly darkened until it was a vibrant purple hue. Her chakra coils, although they hadn't truly been that since he had made his changes, stretched and hummed as the denser energy flowed through them and absorbed the human chakra that remained, replacing it with the Yuki her body was now producing. He also paid attention to the physical changes. Her entire body began to hum with energy, her blood pumping faster and her nerves firing more quickly. Her muscles contracted swiftly and easily, the energy coiling within just waiting to be released in an explosive burst. Her skin, rather than growing fur, instead seemed to gain a slightly leathery quality. Finally, he withdrew his Yuki back into his own body, leaving Ino surrounded by a purple aura that clung to her skin and blended almost seamlessly into her clothing. He'd often wondered at that, actually. Ino's situation was literally unique, but he had half expected her Yuki to be red like his own, as he had provided the changes that made this possible, and she had spent so much time around him. Instead, her Yuki was a hue that perfectly matched her favorite color. He wasn't sure if that was coincidence or not. With a deep breath, Ino opened her eyes, revealing shimmering purple orbs that were completely pupilless. Ready? Kushu asked, grinning in anticipation as he reinforced his body with Yuki. Rather than replying verbally, Ino launched herself forward, her form blurring as she attacked. A sharp crack echoed throughout the room as they met. One of Kushu's hands had caught Ino's as she tried to punch him in the stomach, and their forearms were currently pushing against one another as he intercepted the chop aimed at his throat. Much like their physical positions, Ino's purple aura was pushing against Kushu's red one, the energy swirling in a chaotic dance as they vied for an advantage. They held their position for a moment before Kushu's aura flared and threw Ino backwards. Ino landed easily, flexing her hands and flaring her own aura as she called forth more Yuki. Always, Ino replied, her eyes dancing with delight and laughter. April 11th, 348 NE. Amigakure. Don't you fucking insult Jashin-sama, you asshole! Someone yelled up ahead. Fu couldn't hear the reply, but she did hear the inarticulate scream of rage and the clang of metal on metal. She hesitated to continue, but she had been informed that Leader Sama was calling a meeting and that she was required to attend. She hesitantly pushed open the door, immediately spotting the source of the disturbance. The gray-haired man known as Haiden was flailing his scythe around, trying to murder a large man with blue skin that she recognized as Kisame Hashigaki. The Kiri missing nin was using a large, cloth-wrapped object to effortlessly block or deflect the fanatic's uncoordinated strikes, a mocking smirk on his face. On the far side of the room she saw Jun and Kyoko sitting next to Konan. Jun was watching the fight with excitement shining on his face while Kyoko was doing her absolute best to mimic Konan's expression and posture. The effect was somewhat ruined as she kept shooting glances towards her idol. Konan herself had her head propped against her arm which was resting against the table, a bored and annoyed expression on her face. She wasn't doing anything to stop the fighting though. I wish they'd stop doing this every time, a voice said from beside the door, startling Fu. She turned to find Deidara, the one member of Akatsuki she would feel confident calling a friend, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He was looking at her, though his eyes would flicker to the battle every now and then as he watched its progress. This happens a lot? She asked as she settled onto the wall beside him, tucking her arms behind her head. Yeah, Kisame-dana doesn't like Haiden, and Haiden is very easy to get riled up, She nodded, watching Haiden continue to flail at Kisame without even coming close to hitting him. Her eyes snapped to the other side of the room as Orochimaru entered, his arrogant smirk firmly set on his face. His eyes seemed to gleam as he saw the battle occurring, but he just settled into a chair away from everyone else without saying anything. "So how have you been, Deidara asked quietly, drawing Fu into a conversation. She actually enjoyed talking to him, most of the time, and he managed to avoid ranting about his art, most of the time. They were discussing the best aerial views in the area when Leader-sama entered the room, his cloak swirling about him, and his red hair pulled back into a ponytail. "Haiden, Kisame," he said, his voice calm and even. Haiden froze, then slowly backed away from Kisame and put away his scythe. "Sorry, Leader-sama," he said, ducking his head slightly. "But Fishface insulted Jashin-sama again, and I had to punish his heathen ways." Kisame secured the bundle on his back again and shrugged. "It passed the time," he replied. Leader-sama eyed them for a moment, then shook his head. "Konoha and Suna have finally declared war against IWA," he began, "and are deploying their Jinchuriki to the front lines. Thanks to our newest member," he said, nodding his head slightly in Orochimaru's direction, "we have confirmed that Naruto Yamanaka is the Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed beast." Fu gasped. "Is there something you wish to add?" Leader-sama asked, turning to look at her. She shook her head rapidly. "My apologies, Leader-sama, it's just, that's the boy from Konoha who kept pestering me while I was still in Taki. He never said he was a Jinchuriki, though." Leader-sama nodded after a moment, and then turned his attention back to the rest of the room. "Both he and Gaara will be taking part in the attack on Iwagakure. I believe that we will find an opportunity to capture or kill them in the confusion and chaos of the battle. Kisame, you and Deidara are assigned to take out Gaara. He has shown the capacity to assume a beast form fashioned of dirt and stone, so Deidara's explosions may be key to defeating him, and I suspect your water jutsu will slow him down. You will have full authority to call off the attempt if you do not believe you can take him out and escape afterwards. Fu will be providing you with aerial support and your primary method of retreat. Haiden, you will be working with Orochimaru to take out Naruto. Orochimaru has fought him before and is the most familiar with his unusual capabilities, and your worship of Jashin should allow you to keep him incapacitated or outright kill him despite his advanced healing. Orochimaru will simply need to retrieve a small amount of blood, a task that should be well within his considerable capabilities. His puppetry techniques will allow him to make the attempt without any risk to himself. Conan will be providing you with aerial support, but you will need to retreat on your own. Your groups will also have some intermediate objectives to help maximize the chaos of the battlefield. Jun and Kyoko will be providing distractions for your assault and cover for your retreat, as well as generally damaging anyone they can. None of the villages involved are allied with us, and any damage they sustain serves to strengthen our own position later." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Where will you be during all of this?" Orochimaru hissed, eyeing the red-haired man in the center of the room. "I will be acting as reinforcements should the situation turn against us. I should not need to step in personally, as I expect everyone to be capable of performing the tasks I have assigned them." Orochimaru chuckled to himself but didn't ask anything further. Seeing that no one else was going to voice any objections, Leader-sama nodded again. "I suggest you start spending some time with your partners to become familiar with their skills and habits, as well as review the information we have on your targets. Konoha and Suna are going to move out soon, and you will need to move out quickly when they do. We will discuss the specifics of timing and positioning once our source provides us with the information." His eyes swept the room again. Dismissed. Chapter 48, Snake Eyes. April 15th, 348 NE. Yamanaka Residence. "You wanted to talk to me, Tusan?" Kushu asked curiously as he entered Inoichi's office. It had been quite a while since he had been in this particular room, he noted idly. It had been several months since they had any sort of counseling session, and Inoichi preferred to use the common areas of the house when he wasn't actively working. "I did," Inoichi acknowledged from behind his desk. That was also unusual. Inoichi only used the desk when he was working, never during counseling sessions. He hadn't explicitly said this was a counseling session, of course, but there was no other reason to talk in his office if that was the case. "If you'll close the door and have a seat?" Kushu did so, studying the man who had adopted him curiously. He looked worn out, but then all of the senior ninja in Konoha did. They were gearing up for war and would be setting out in a matter of days. There were hundreds of things that needed to be done, and they all needed to be done immediately. Inoichi activated the privacy seals, then leaned back, rubbing his hands over his eyes tiredly. "I know I've been really busy lately and haven't been around much," he began apologetically, "so I wanted to spend a little time with you before Konoha officially marches on IWA." "I know you've been busy, Tusan," Kushu replied. "I understand." Inoichi grimaced. "I appreciate that, but I still wanted to do this. We are going to war, and I think we both know that there are no guarantees. Kushu shrugged and settled into his chair. Okay, so Ino tells me that your awesome secret training is going well, but I haven't gotten your perspective on it. How do you think things are going? He held up his hand, a knowing grin on his face. I'm not going to ask what it is, even if you did want to tell me. I think Ino would kill us both for spoiling the surprise. Kushu chuckled in agreement. She would. As for how it's going very well. We've been making rapid progress in the time we have before we head out, though of course it's still not as fast as Ino would like. Patience still eludes her, it seems. Her grandmother was the same way, both of them, actually. My mom used to say that she didn't have the time to waste on being patient. I'm sure she'll settle down eventually. I hope. Inoichi trailed off, laughing nervously. Kushu's lips twisted into a dutiful smile. He'd heard this a number of times before, though Inoichi still seemed to find it amusing. What about your assignment? I got an earful from Ino about Team Kakashi getting split up, but you haven't said anything about it. It's not like it's permanent, Kushu said, shrugging. I assume Shikaku hasn't talked to you about what I may end up doing. Yes, Inoichi muttered, frowning. I'm not happy about that, but he has his reasons. If I can help end everything faster, then I will, Kushu said, managing to keep a straight face as he did so. I'd like to think that having this thing stuck in my gut is actually useful for more than just pissing off Sasuke. Inoichi nodded, smirking slightly. Chusa still claims that was the funniest thing he's ever seen, you know. Kushu laughed out loud. It was one of the funniest things he'd ever seen too. One day several years ago, Sasuke had come charging through the house and straight into their backyard, honing in on him like an attack dog. He'd loudly proclaimed that he was finally going to best him in a spar, then activated his newly acquired Sharingan. The look of complete shock on his face when he saw the Yuki aura that surrounded him, and realized that he couldn't read his movements, after all, had been priceless. It certainly hadn't helped that the Yamanaka, Nara, and Akimichi families were in the middle of their weekly cookout at the time, or that the older ninja had immediately realized what had just happened and burst out laughing. Still, Inoichi said, his smile fading, I don't like that we're putting you in that position. If something should happen, I'll be fine. If would-be assassins and resurrected Hokages can't stop me, IWA won't stand a chance. I may not end up having to do anything either. IWA could finally come to their senses and surrender. Orochimaru cut off your arm and Itachi nearly killed you, Inoichi pointed out. Kushu felt confused for a moment before he realized that Inoichi had taken his reference to the assassin who had tried to kill Gaara during the invasion to mean something else. Rather than correcting him, though, he just shrugged. And yet, here I am, he replied, motioning with his right arm for emphasis. Inoichi sighed and nodded, though he seemed distracted by something. I worry, you know, he admitted after a second. Someday all of your training and all the advantages the tailed beast gives you aren't going to be enough. Kushu wanted to laugh at that thought, but he shoved the impulse aside. Someday, perhaps, he said instead, but I'll be fighting them tooth and nail every step of the way. April 16 H. 348 NE. Hokage's office. Shikaku watched as Inoichi barged into his office once again, his hand already motioning for the ANBU to leave and seal the room. His blond-haired friend began pacing back and forth in front of the desk, the folders still clutched in his hands. Remember how we could never figure out just what it was that sent Itachi over the edge? How we could never explain why he left Naruto alive? How Kushu has mentioned a mysterious source, but we have never once been able to explain how and where he gets his information. How we still don't know just what Itachi was doing before and during the Chunin exams. Shikaku leaned back, his mind whirling as he tried to follow the path Inoichi's questions were taking. You found something else out, I take it? I brought up Itachi to Kushu yesterday when he mentioned would-be assassins. When I did, he actually looked confused for a moment. And that got me thinking, remember how Ino would get upset or angry every time Itachi's name was mentioned? She hasn't been doing that lately either. Inoichi stepped up to the desk, slapping the folder onto the polished wood, and then turned to resume his rapid pacing. Never trust your eyes, he growled out. Shikaku's eyes widened as he saw Naruto's ANBU file, and his mind recalled Itachi's mysterious utterance just before he had defected. Bits and pieces of theories and unexplained observations suddenly merged together, meshing perfectly to form a new and disturbing picture. There must have been something in the folder, something that everyone but Itachi had overlooked. Something that revealed Kushu's true nature. Perhaps his time training Kushu had allowed him to see something everyone else had missed. Or perhaps Kushu had let something slip that he had carefully hidden from everyone else, some vital piece of information that allowed Itachi to discover what was really going on. What happened in the forest then? Did the revelation unhinge him, the loss of one of his few remaining friends to the tailed beast? No. Inoichi had already put together an alternate theory, and Shikaku could see how it fit. Itachi had confronted Kushu, but he had done it privately, quietly. A loyal ninja would have immediately alerted the Hokage, but Itachi didn't. Even the fact that Itachi had left Naruto alive, a nearly unheard of mistake from one of the most skilled and thorough ninja Konoha had ever produced, fit. It wasn't an oversight brought on by disorientation or mental trauma. It was a ruse to conceal what had really happened in that clearing, and if he assumed that Itachi was the source of Kushu's information, then many other inconsistencies were resolved. Itachi delivered the information on Akatsuki. Itachi provided the warning that Gaara was being targeted for assassination. Shikaku's eyes narrowed as he reviewed Kushu's relationships with the people in Konoha. The two most obvious were Itachi, who was now a missing nin, and Ino, who had been subverted and could no longer be trusted to be loyal to Konoha first. Then there was Shizen, who had tried for years to gain custody of Naruto and was still not completely cleared of suspicion for the desertion of Tsunade and Kushina. He paled, his eyes widening. Tsunade and Kushina didn't know, and one or both of them had helped Kushu gain access to the Namikaze compound. Jiraiya was also helping the tailed beast grow stronger, though he had fortunately been busy enough that keeping them apart was a simple and easily explained task. Jiraiya's ties with the summons would ensure he would never willingly join Kushu, but the same could not be said for Kushina. Even Tsunade was in doubt, despite the fact that she was the slug summoner. As far as he knew, she was not a sage and had never even attempted to pursue that path. What about the other clan kids? Hinata had a crush on Naruto, though there was no indication that anything had come of it. Kiba and, to a lesser extent, Sasuke both attempted to compete with Naruto at every opportunity. Shikamaru, his own son, viewed him as an entertaining opponent for their weekly shugi matches, and they had become close friends over the years. The others didn't have a particular attachment to him over and above the rest, but they all respected him. Had the tailed beast's manipulations extended to them as well and the adults just hadn't seen it, or dismissed it as childish playing? Just how much had the tailed beast really accomplished before they realized what he truly was? What had he really been doing all those times he slipped away to practice on his own? Every time they thought they knew everything he had done, another layer was revealed to show just how much they had missed. Troublesome didn't even begin to cover it. April 19th, 348 NE-2:00 p.m. Land of Earth, 50 kilometers southeast of Iwagakure. Troublesome. Shikamaru sighed as his squad leapt through the trees towards their next target. The fighting had already begun, and he was part of a team tasked with clearing and securing points of interest after the frontline fighters had taken care of any initial resistance. They were also expected to function as the first wave of reinforcements, though he suspected that had more to do with the squad leader than anything else. Everything was going according to Konoha's plans so far, more or less. The Hyuga were out in full force, every able-bodied ninja in the clan deployed as Konoha and Suna swept across Iwa like a plague. Every bunker was uncovered, every cache of weapons plundered, every spot of resistance ruthlessly crushed. From the aftermath, it looked like fighting so far had been relatively minimal, and at least in the areas they had seen there had been no deaths and few casualties. His own team had a Hyuga on it as well, though it was not one he was acquainted with. He had worked with Hinata as part of the clan kids and had a decent professional relationship with Niji, but both of them had been assigned to more sensitive areas. Instead, he was working with a Chunin several years his senior, a girl named Matsubi. Another Chunin from a civilian background rounded out the subordinates on the squad. As for the leader, everything is troublesome to you, Shika, Naruto remarked, smirking. The recently promoted Tokubetsu Jounin was proving to be an adept commander, as his relaxed, confident manner helped calm the nerves of the team he was leading. It also helped that he had officially been rated AA in combat following the abbreviated trials he had undergone. In the unlikely event that they encountered any resistance, he would be able to handle it on his own. They had yet to actually need to fight anyone, however. How many more targets are we supposed to secure today, Yamanaka Taicho? Matsubi asked. Just 2, Naruto replied. The last update indicated that the scouts had uncovered 2 bunkers. One's just a glorified weapons cache, but the second is a hardened position that the strike teams should be hitting soon. We are to seal up anything of value and then collapse the first one before we make our way to the second. Once there, we are to begin fortifying and hold that position until we receive further orders. Shikamaru frowned thoughtfully. How far is that one from Iwagakure? About 20 kilometers, Naruto replied after a moment. Shikamaru nodded thoughtfully. That was close enough to be useful as a command post, but far enough away that they would have time to detect and respond to any attacks. A ninja could cover that distance in under 10 minutes if they pushed. Thoroughly sweeping such a bunker would require the eyes of a Hyuga, and having someone with Naruto's sealing experience would make the job both faster and safer. His other teammate, Yashiro, had a solid B combat ranking and specialized in ranged attacks, making for a good complement to the rest of the team. They arrived at the weapons cache a few minutes later to find the strike team waiting for them. The cache was already emptied out by the time we got here. Bastards left us a few parting gifts though, the captain of the team said, spitting off to the side. 2 fucking gas tags and an exploding tag buried inside a broken crate filled with kunai, along with a sampling of the usual. Nothing Winky here couldn't handle. The leader was referring to their Hyuga team member, one of the 2 living Hyuga in all of Konoha who had lost one of their eyes and the only one still in active service. The one-eyed ninja, Hirota, Shikamaru thought his name was, bore the moniker easily, long since used to the name. We'll take it from here, Naruto interrupted, a lazy grin on his face. You're on to the bunker next? The leader's expression grew somber, and he nodded. Yeah. We're supposed to meet up with some other teams first, though. Shikamaru nodded in sympathy. IWA had been retreating rapidly, but this close to the village itself that was likely to change. If the bunker was defended, it would be by well-rested ninja who were ready and waiting to repel any attackers. The attackers, on the other hand, would be far from fresh even if they regrouped and rested a little before they struck. Unlike IWA, Konoha couldn't afford to wait indefinitely. It was uncertain whether they would be able to take the bunker intact at all, but they had been ordered to try. Good luck, Shikamaru said, his sentiment quickly echoed by his teammates. The strike team nodded in acknowledgement before they took off. April 20th, 348 NE-6:00 p.m. Just outside of Iwagakure, Sarutobi stared at the shimmering wall of harmless-looking dust and dirt that surrounded Iwagakure, most of his attention occupied with analyzing its properties and attempting to come up with countermeasures. A smaller part, though much larger than he liked to admit even to himself, was focused on something entirely different. He was tired, not physically, though he wasn't quite as spry and energetic as he had been in years long past. No, this was a weariness that had settled deep in his soul. From the moment he had heard about Iwa's Jinchuriki wiping out Taki, he had known he would find himself on the field of battle once again. The drums of war had begun their familiar cadence, a beat that had once upon a time set his blood thrumming through his veins and, as Guy would put it, stoked the flames of his youth. In years past he might have moved among his troops, offering encouragement here or advice there, making sure they were ready and getting a feel for their morale. He might have made grand speeches to the assembled forces, reminding them of what Konoha stood for, and why their village had never and would never fall. He might have thrown himself into the preparations, refining his techniques and trying to master just one more technique that might prove to make the difference between victory and defeat. He was older now, and wiser. And so very tired. The lungs that had once bellowed war cries and rousing speeches now emitted quiet sighs. The ninja, though they respected and revered him, looked to other men for leadership and guidance now. All techniques he cared to learn had long since been mastered. The drums may be beating once again, but this time he was simply going through the motions. We will win, Hiruzen, a quiet voice said from his right. Sarutobi inclined his head slightly, acknowledging Shikako as his successor, the second one, and that thought just served to increase the ache in his heart that little bit more, joined him. Sometimes I wonder if winning is even possible, he replied quietly. We won the first war, and the second, and the third, did we not? And yet here we are again, fighting the same battles against the same enemies for the same reasons. What has changed? What has winning done for us? The younger man was silent for nearly a minute, his eyes watching the barrier surrounding their target as it rippled and glinted in the sunlight. We are still alive, Sarutobi laughed ruefully, shaking his head and dismissing his prior thoughts. Very true, Hokage-sama. There is that. But I'm sure you haven't come here to listen to the ramblings of an old man. Shikako nodded. Jiraiya says he's got something. Sarutobi swept his eyes across the barrier one more time, drawing in a deep breath and letting the fresh morning air fill his lungs. A shift in his mindset, a mental trick mastered long ago, hardened his eyes and cleared the last of his extraneous thoughts from his mind. Then let us see what he has for us. He may be going through the motions, but he knew the tune by heart, and he could still dance with the best of them. April 20th. 348 NE-6:30 p.m. Just outside of Iwagakure, Jiraiya sat back on his heels, admiring the barrier before him. Hundreds of individual streams of chakra were woven together so tightly that not the tiniest gap could be seen. If the barrier were clothing, he doubted even a sewing needle would be able to penetrate the fabric. It wasn't just chakra either, though that alone would have been impressive enough. No, it was fully elemental chakra, the majority of it earth-natured. There was just enough of a second type of chakra to identify that Tsuchikage's legendary dust element in the mix. An observation confirmed through the sacrifice of a kunai, the chakra dissolving the metal like water sweeping away bubbles of soap, and the sheer scope of it. The barrier towered nearly 40 meters in the air, completely solid all the way, and surrounded the entire village. He knew from examining it from higher vantage points that it curved over the village, protecting it from above as well. Iwagakure was a small village by modern standards, but even so the barrier must be enclosing nearly 10 square kilometers. The barrier used to trap the nine-tailed beast had been rumored to be the largest ever actually used across the elemental nations, but this absolutely dwarfed that. It almost made him feel sad that he was going to completely destroy it. Almost. Jiraiya! He heard his teacher bark, the sharp tone making him stiffen guiltily in a childhood reflex he never quite managed to get rid of before he controlled himself. He rocked back on his heels for a moment before pushing himself to his full height and turning to face the men approaching him. "Yes, sensei?" he asked casually. "You said you found something. Can you take it down?" "Of course I can. Who do you think you're talking to?" "I am known." A yes would suffice. Sarutobi cut him off, though his lips twitched slightly. "What do you need to do?" "This barrier is a work of art, sensei, but it's an old work of art. Just studying the flow patterns I can tell that it's using Noriashi's matrix. The design is incredibly efficient and stable, which made it the base of choice for just about any large-scale array since it was created. I've even used it myself several times when I was starting out. Such as never mind," he said quickly, noting the look of impatience on his teacher's face. "The point is that I stopped using it because I discovered a rather nasty flaw. The load-balancing arrays don't account for the possibility of opposing chakra elements entering at the same time, and I couldn't fix it without rewriting the entire damn thing. They're only using earth and dust elements, though," Sarutobi pointed out. "Those aren't opposing." Jiraiya just nodded, grinning. "You're right. As it is the only limit they have to deal with is chakra, and if they'd been storing up chakra and pace themselves, we're looking at weeks before it starts to weaken." Sarutobi frowned, looking at him pointedly. "Luckily for us," Jiraiya said, grinning, "all we need to do is give it a little boost." April 20th, 348 NE-7:00 p.m. Inside Iwagakure, Owanoki stretched, his bones crackling and shifting as his body protested the movement. "Any new movements?" he asked. "Some, Tsuchikage-sama," his ninja replied. "Both the third and fifth Hokages are speaking with Jiraiya near the barrier." "My lord, if you would just allow us to." "No." The denial was swift and firm. "We cannot afford to open a hole in the barrier long enough to strike at them." "My lord, you need only lower it long enough for the team to make it through from the inside. You need not worry about them returning. I would be proud to lead the assault myself if necessary." Owanoki turned to the man for a moment, a grim smile on his face. "Your dedication is noted, but that is not my concern. If I thought the strike would succeed, I would lead the charge myself. No, my concern is that one of them would manage to take advantage of the opening. Sarutobi is sly and cunning, Jiraiya is powerful, and the Nara, while not as powerful on his own, makes the other two even more so. They are no doubt prepared for an attack. Indeed, they may be intentionally trying to lure us out. My lord, if we could kill even one of them, it would be a great blow to Konoha, no doubt. But if even one of them were to penetrate the barrier, especially the Seal Master Jiraiya, then they could take it down from the inside. I am not willing to trade all of IWA for the death of one man." Another ninja approached, bowing low before he delivered his report. "Tsuchikage-sama, the Hokages and Jiraiya have fallen back for now. Jiraiya has inscribed a large sealing array at the base of the barrier, but no one is fueling it, and it appears to be inactive at the moment. Masayun-sama is already working to decipher its purpose. So far he states that it is some sort of barrier technique itself." Owanoki rubbed his chin thoughtfully. They could be trying to set up footholds in an effort to strike the moment we open our own barrier, or perhaps a safe area to work as they attempt to destroy it. Keep an eye on it, and inform me immediately if they start creating any more elsewhere." April 21st, 348 NE-1:00 AM, -20 km SE of Iwagakure. Kush's eyes strained to make out the figures scurrying around the base of the barrier. This far away, he could just barely make out scurrying flecks of movement that were nearly washed out by the large wall of dust that concealed Iwagakure. After securing the bunker, his team had been ordered to stand by for further orders. The bunker itself had been cracked open when they arrived, evidence of powerful lightning and earth techniques scarring the fortification. The strike team they had been following was nowhere in sight, though he was unsure whether that meant they had perished or already moved on to another area. He hadn't bothered to track their signatures, though he would likely recognize them if he encountered them again. Well, other than the one-eyed Hyuga, that particular one had been amusing enough to remember. Since then he had just been waiting. He passed the time tracking the progress of the invading army as it slowly encircled the Wagakure, but the area he could sense wasn't particularly active. He also found himself constantly scanning for Ino's signature, even though he knew she was stationed far to the northeast. He had noted that Hinata had briefly been close enough to sense before moving farther south. The other members of the team he was leading were currently asleep, resting in case they were called in as reinforcements. He personally thought that he would be the only one called up any time soon. None of the others were powerful enough or skilled enough to survive long in the bloody melee that would erupt once the assault on the village itself began. He grinned in the darkness, his light purple eyes shining through the gloom. He was actually looking forward to the battle to come. Not only would he get a chance to see just how well his human techniques stood up to stronger ninja, but it would no doubt serve to further his reputation. And then, once a Wagakure had been taken care of, the revelation that the village really didn't have any Jinchuriki would focus the attention of the great ninja villages onto Akatsuki. And past that, well, Kumo still had 2 of his brethren captive. That couldn't be allowed to continue. His thoughts were interrupted when he sensed a messenger ninja racing towards the command tent. It seemed that something was finally happening. Less than a minute after the messenger entered, he left again, running towards the southwest. The jounin in charge of the group Kushu was assigned to came out a moment later, flaring his chakra and rousing the other ninja in the camp. Once everyone was assembled, he began snapping orders. The following squads are to hold this position and prepare to receive wounded. Akimichi Subaru Hayasuk, he continued, listing off a total of 10 squads and thus 40 ninja. Everyone else is moving out towards IWA. The Hokage says the barrier is coming down within the hour, and we are going to be ready. The mood of the assembled group sharpened at the announcement, many of the ninja reflexively checking their gear to make sure all of their tools were ready and in place. Yamanaka! The jounin snapped suddenly. That doesn't apply to you. Your squad is now under my command, but you are to head out immediately and report directly to the Hokage. Any questions? Kushu shook his head, already moving to gather up the rest of his gear. He had expected something like this, after all. Move it! The jounin barked from behind him, spurring the rest of the group into action. Shikamaru moved up beside him, the Naruto's expression solemn. Good luck, Naruto, he said. Kushu paused a moment before nodding in acknowledgement. Same to you, Shika. And I wouldn't worry too much. I can't afford to die while you are in the lead, he added, referring to the running score of their shugi matches. Shikamaru smirked. You'll just have to get used to that. April 21st, 348 NE, -1:45 AM, -1 kilometer of a Wagakure. You can't be serious, Kushu growled, his temper threatening to get the better of him. Completely, Shikaku replied easily, his eyes still studying the map before him even as his hands were busy strapping pouches to his body. You are to be held in reserve should either of the Jinchuriki show themselves. You are one of the best counters we have, and we can't afford for you to be pinned down or out of communication within IWA itself should they try to flank us. Your presence here will also allow Jiraiya and Sarutobi-sama to direct our forces within IWA instead of holding them in reserve as well. If you would just send me and then IWA would fall that much quicker, saving lives there as well, he pointed out. Shikaka lifted his head to stare him in the eyes, an unimpressed look on his face. If you want to be involved in this battle, it will be as a counter to enemy Jinchuriki. Otherwise, your presence on the battlefield is not required, Kushu snarled, turning and stalking out of the tent. Things had been so much simpler when Sarutobi was still in command, though, on reflection, the old man was even less likely to let him fight, if for different reasons. As it was, he was being held in reserve to combat a threat that would never appear, and in the end he would never set foot on the battlefield at all. There would be no tales of his combat prowess spreading throughout Konoha and the other villages after this, no glowing reports of enemies defeated and fellow ninja rescued to boost his reputation and raise his status. He would be the ninja simply watching while others bled and died. Even those who understood why he was held back would probably still resent him on some level, especially when they realized that his AA rating put him in the top 10% of Konoha's forces when it came to combat. He wouldn't put it past Shikaku to be doing this to achieve that very result, though he knew that the Hokage actually believed that IWA still had possession of their Jinchuriki. That didn't make the situation any less annoying, however. He came to a stop at the edge of the camp, climbing atop the stone wall to glare into the distance at the walls. He was close enough now to see the barrier clearly, to sense the hundreds of chakra signatures that were woven together, blending and merging as they formed the wall of shifting earth that protected the village. More ninja, including Shikaku, made their towards the village, leaving behind a skeleton crew to guard the base, mostly Chunin with the occasional Tokubetsu Jounin to command them. It was ironic that they were keeping him and Gaara out of the fighting. Gaara probably could have turned the barrier against the village in a matter of moments, and Ryudo could have used it to devastate them for certain. Of course, that would be relying on a Jinchuriki, and it was becoming clear that they didn't want to do that. Something about the barrier shifted abruptly, drawing his attention. He focused on the feeling, narrowing it down and filtering out the other sensations until he found the source emanating from Jiraiya's array. When natured chakra was entering the barrier, the single thread flowing around and through the other strands as it joined the others already present. There was a slight disruption where it interrupted some of the earth-natured threads, but those were quickly bridged and flowing smoothly after just a few moments. Whatever he was trying to do didn't seem to be working very well so far. Jiraiya's thread continued on its path, eventually moving downwards towards the base of the walls until it hit what seemed to be the array that controlled the barrier itself. He winced at the sensation that followed. It was a distant echo of what he had experienced when he entered Ryudo's seal the first time, the feeling of chakra tearing itself apart and slamming back together, ripping and grinding and shifting all the while. The barrier's appearance changed, the flowing surface starting to move in fits and starts, the effect spreading like a ripple across the deceptively smooth surface. Gaps began appearing, small holes that revealed the interior of the village and allowed his senses to clearly penetrate for the first time. Those holes grew and shrank, moving seemingly at random as the barrier weakened even further. Finally, with a flare of chakra that even the humans must have felt, the barrier collapsed. The failure of the technique was accompanied by the audible crack of shattering stone that echoed off of the mountains around Iwagakure. The immediate damage appeared to be limited to a section of the barrier several hundred meters long, but he could see other sections in the distance that had fallen as well, and the sections still standing were deteriorating rapidly. He watched as Konoha and soon a ninja began pouring into the village, flashes of chakra and plumes of fire marking their progress as they began the assault. No doubt the Iwa had been caught off guard by the sudden loss of their greatest defense, and he could tell that the initial attacks were penetrating deeply, especially those led by Jiraiya and Sarutobi. They were nearing the limits of his senses, but from their path they were probably heading directly towards the Tsuchikage Tower. It seemed unlikely that he would have a chance to take part at all. April 21st, 348 NE-3:00 AM, 10 kilometers south of Iwagakure. Gaara paced back and forth restlessly, his sandals clacking against the stony ground as he moved. Most of the ninja around him giving him a wide berth as they sensed his agitation. They no longer thought that he would lash out at them indiscriminately. A change in perception helped considerably by the fact that he hadn't killed any allies or civilians in nearly a year. But they also had no desire to test his newfound restraint. He had been left behind while the bulk of Suna's forces, nearly 90% of their able-bodied ninja and yet still half the size of the force Konoha was fielding, closed in on Iwa. Baki wanted him kept in reserve until Iwa deployed their Jinchuriki, or so he said. Gaara probably wouldn't have taken the orders nearly as well as he did, but both Temari and Kankuro were still with him and keeping him calm. Looks like the barrier fell as planned, Kankuro reported. He was currently seated on the ground, his back against a small boulder, and the hood of his combat suit pulled back to reveal his short, spiky hair. His eyes were closed and his fingers twitching seemingly at random as he controlled the small bird puppet currently wheeling in the sky above them. No signals or flares so far, Temari huffed quietly, her hands occupied with inspecting her battle fan for any minute imperfections. If the barrier's down then this should almost be over, she replied, her voice tinged with relief. Gaara frowned, stopping his restless movement as his gaze focused on the village to the north. He had hoped to join the assault at some point, to get a chance to explore his powers once more while destroying his enemies. The feeling when Ryudo took control and pushed his fledgling control to the limits that his human body could support, the sensation of crushing the enemy ninja under a stony limb that both was and was not his own, the feeling of their panicked chakra washing over him as they tried to flee in terror. It had been intoxicating, and he couldn't wait to feel it again. Even more so if he was the one in control. He had killed many people before, but that had been to make the screaming stop. Now that there was no more screaming, that the inside of his own head was, mostly, his own, he found that the thought of just striking out randomly was almost distasteful. But if they made themselves his enemy? If they threatened his family? A wide, eager grin spread across his face, causing everyone but Kankuro, who didn't see it, and Temari, who had seen much worse, to unconsciously increase the distance between them. He could also feel the approval of his fellow prisoner welling up from within him, the Yuki somehow conveying a limited form of emotion to him. Then the emotion abruptly changed, and he felt Ryudo pulling him back into his mind until he felt the dry desert winds of his mindscape flowing across his skin. Most of his attention was still in the real world, but there was just enough focused inward for them to communicate clearly. Someone is coming, Ryudo said without preamble. Who? I don't know, but they're strong. Stronger than anyone in Suna. And they're coming here? I think so. They seem to be heading straight towards us. And there's something above it, something Akatsuki. Ryudo suddenly hissed. I can feel Shiju's Jinchuriki in the sky, and someone else is with her. Hey, Kankuro said suddenly. There's something in the sky approaching from the south. It's way too big to be a normal bird. The jounin in command of their group, Norimaki, one of Baki's closest and most trusted friends, eyed the black-clad puppeteer for a moment before nodding. Eyes open, he snapped to the rest of the group. We may have company shortly. Temari, I want you in the air. Kankuro, coordinate with her. Got it, the blonde replied quickly, snapping her fan open and leaping into the air. She barely made it a meter before she found herself gently cocooned by a fist of earth. No, Gaara said quietly. Too dangerous. Gaara? Temari asked, her voice surprised and confused. I can feel it, he said, his body tense and his gaze focused southward. It's a Jinchuriki. The group was silent for a moment before they exploded into motion. Shit, 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 chanted Norimaki as adrenaline flooded his veins. It's the seven-tailed Jinchuriki, has to be. Fucking IWA is ambushing us. Yusuke, get word to the Kazekage, now? Takiha, make for the Konoha lines and make sure they know. One of the others is probably going to hit them soon, if they aren't already. The two ninja left immediately, shedding their packs and any excess weight as they pushed their bodies for as much speed as they could achieve. Gaara. I don't care if they're flying, do everything you can to take them out. Throw fucking rocks at them, I don't know. Just make it happen. Gaara didn't say anything, his gaze focused at ground level to the south. Ryudo was telling him that whoever it was getting close. Gaara! Norimaki snapped. Snap out oh! A wall of earth exploded out of the ground as fast as he could manage, but he was still too slow to block the attack completely. A stream of water lanced into the clearing, the tip of the attack razor sharp. It barely missed Gaara as the ground around his feet wrapped around his legs and shifted him sideways, moving him out of the way of the attack. The lance of water flew past Gaara and his siblings, slicing into and through three of the ninja still present before slamming into and through the rocks behind them and disappearing into the distance. The rest of the attack was cut off by his wall, though he could feel the water drilling into the chakra and Yuki-hardened substance with surprising effectiveness. He reinforced the wall, hardening it further as well as adding more raw material, and the attack ended after a few more seconds. Ryudo informed him that the two ninja in the sky were bypassing the group entirely, splitting up as they chased after the messengers Norimaki had dispatched. That left a single ninja against himself, Temari, Kankuro, and Norimaki. Almost absently, he released Temari from her cocoon and began walking forward, putting some distance between himself and the others. Het, came the amused voice of the ninja attacking them. Not bad, Red. The ninja that finally stepped into view from behind a small rock outcropping was tall, very tall. He was clad in a black cloak decorated with red clouds that covered most of his form and had a straw hat covering his head. The bit of skin he could see on his face was blue. There was also a large, cloth-wrapped bundle on his back. As he watched, one arm emerged from the cloak and grabbed the handle that stuck out of the bundle, the exposed limb confirming that yes, his skin actually was blue. Norimaki moved to the left, beginning to circle around the attacker. Temari and Kankuro did the same to his right, his brother swiftly unwrapping his puppet and flexing his fingers as he prepared for battle. Stay back, Gaara commanded, one hand raised in warning. Better listen to him, the Akatsuki-nin said as he pulled the bundle off of his back. Don't give a shit about the rest of you, but Red here has to go, one way or the other. A blurred figure swept down from the sky behind the ninja, the vaguely arrow-shaped thing aimed straight for him. The cloaked figure didn't even bother to turn, just swung the bundle behind him and swatted the thing out of the air effortlessly, the blow accompanied by the sound of shattering wood. A victorious cry from Kankuro cut off suddenly in a strangled exclamation. What? How did you dash, puppeteer, right? Asked the figure, sounding bored. Yeah, whatever little traps you had on that thing aren't going to work. What happened? Norimaki called out. My connection to the puppet just vanished. Kankuro shouted back, alerting his allies to the ninja's odd ability. You gonna back off or not? The ninja asked. None of the Sunanin facing him replied, though Norimaki and his siblings shifted uncomfortably. Gaara just continued to wait, more and more of Ryudo's Yuki flooding through him as he prepared for the battle. The attacker shrugged, the motion barely visible under the cloak. "Time's a wastin'," he said, "and it wouldn't do for me to let Red here build up any more chakra, would it?" Gaara's eyes widened slightly before he abruptly attacked, stone claws rising out of the rocky ground below the ninja and swiping at his form. The ninja began moving quickly, dodging some attacks and using the bundle as a bludgeon to shatter others. Temari took to the sky to gain some distance, one hand pulling out a smaller fan while the other held onto the larger fan she was crouching on. Kankuro seemed uncertain for a moment, but he eventually began circling the attacker, keeping his puppet nearby and sending out streams of poison needles. Norimaki cursed as his hands blurred through seals and sent blades of winds ripping forwards, the nearly invisible attacks distorting the air. The ninja closed in rapidly, the bundle blurring in his hands as he slapped aside the attacks with almost contemptuous ease. In a matter of seconds he was upon Gaara, the larger side of the bundle sweeping horizontally towards his torso and connecting, only for Gaara's form to burst into shards of stone and earth. "Not bad at all," the ninja said even as the earth beneath his feet began to tremble. Chapter 49, Snake Eyes Part 2, April 21st, 348 NE, 3:15 AM, 10 kilometers south of Iwagakure. Temari watched from her vantage point in the sky as the massive stone form of the tailed beast rose out of the ground once more. It was difficult to make out details in the dim moonlight, even with the all-sight jutsu, but there was enough illumination that she could make out its tail flicking back and forth behind it. The thought that her brother was working with the beast was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting, because it meant he would remain safe against the many threats to his life. Horrifying, because before that day she would have considered the tailed beast far more of a threat to their safety than any ninja could hope to be. She still wasn't sure that had actually changed. The strange ninja, a Jinchuriki, based on what Gaara had said earlier, dodged the stone claws and the tail that swiped at him with surprising ease. A few times it seemed like he was about to take a hit, but somehow he avoided them. His response was odd too. He was still waving that large bundle around, sweeping it all around him like he was swatting at flies, but he never used it to block or strike at the stone construct directly. And whenever he had a spare moment, he would launch a jutsu, always water, from what she could see, at the beast, the attacks splashing off the beast without any apparent effect. She was still sending blades of wind at the ninja, using the darkness and his distraction against him, but the bundle always intercepted them. Kankuro had retreated far from the battle, studying their opponent and looking for weaknesses. Norimaki had retreated with Kankuro at first, then taken off to the north. If she had to guess, he was going to alert the reinforcements about the current situation. The tailed beast suddenly dropped low to the ground with a loud thud, and for a moment she was worried that the other Jinchuriki had wounded it somehow. Then she saw the pale shadows on the rocky terrain shifting as the ground curled upwards and inwards, churning and crushing everything within. She lost sight of the enemy as he was caught up in the attack, and began to breathe easier. Even if it didn't kill him outright, that surely must have. Her eyes widened and her jaw dropped open as massive waves of water appeared out of thin air, towering high above the rocky outcroppings before rushing inwards. They slammed into the tailed beast's form with a thundering roar, batting the creature back and forth with astonishing force. And there, on the very crest of the last wave, was the other Jinchuriki. He had unwrapped the bundle to reveal something that was vaguely sword-shaped. She couldn't make out the details from this distance, but the way it reflected the moonlight showed that its surface was very uneven. The ninja rode the wave towards the tailed beast, and, when he was close enough, leapt. The beast's tail whipped around to intercept him, something that should have been a certain hit given that the ninja couldn't dodge in midair. Instead, the ninja swung the sword, striking the tail and cleaving through the hardened and unbelievably dense material as it was nothing. The beast roared, the sound full of both anger and pain, and seemed to be momentarily stunned. The ninja didn't waste the opening, his sword carving deep into the beast's side as he struck again. There was another roar, then the beast's body seemed to explode outward as rocky spikes emerged from its form, flying in every direction. The ninja brought his sword in front of him, using its considerable size as a shield. Even protected from the blows as he was, the force still sent him flying away. Temari didn't miss her chance. With the ninja's sword occupied and all of his attention focused on avoiding the beast's latest attack, his back was wide open. The fan she held in her hand swept through the air once, twice, and again. The blades, the sharpest she could make without needing hand signs, ripped through the air and struck. Her grin faltered before it could fully form, however. The blades should have cut the man into pieces, but instead he just had 3 long slices across his back. Blood slowly leaked from the wounds, darkening his clothing and dripping to the ground, forming crimson pools that stood out sharply under the all-sight jutsu. His head turned and stared in her direction for a long moment, then he seemed to dismiss her and moved his focus back to the tailed beast. She growled in anger at being ignored, and put her fan away as she prepared to use some of her stronger and more draining techniques that required hand science. Whatever defense he had wasn't perfect, that much she knew now. She would get another opening, and this time he wouldn't survive. She wasn't sure what tipped her off. She might have seen something out of the corner of her eye, or perhaps her skill as a wind mistress helped her sense the disturbed air. Perhaps it made some noise that she didn't consciously register but still reacted to. She abandoned the technique before it was even properly begun, instead dropping both hands to grip the large fan she was using to float, and pulled. She rolled through the air, her body turning and spinning rapidly as she rode the currents, the sensation almost sickening in its intensity. Katsu, the next few moments were pure chaos. First was the sound, an earth-shattering thunderclap that she could feel in her bones. Mere moments after that, something slammed into her, jarring her body and almost flinging her off the fan. She held on firmly, her fingers nearly denting the metal frame as they dug in, and rode the fan as it tumbled through the air. Then came the heat as it washed over her, the sweat boiling off of her skin and her body feeling as it would catch on fire at any moment. She righted herself automatically, her body operating on instinct even as her mind tried to sort itself out. She blinked rapidly, trying to restore the disrupted all-sight technique as she scanned the dark skies for the source of what must have been an attack. What had it been anyway? An exploding tag attached to a flying puppet? She saw the cloud of smoke hanging in midair immediately, the remains of the explosion already dissipating as the winds tore through it. It took her a couple of seconds longer to locate what must have been the source, a ninja wearing the same style and color of cloak as the Jinchuriki down below. He wasn't wearing the straw hat, though, revealing his long blonde hair that hung over his face on one side, obscuring his features. He was crouched on top of what seemed like a bird, though its skin was the color of clay. "I'm surprised, he called out, his voice sounding a lot younger than she had expected. "You didn't even see it coming and still dodged it, His hands were busy doing something, one digging into a pouch at his side while another was clenching and unclenching. He was probably preparing another puppet to attack her with. She didn't bother to reply, instead pulling out her smaller fan and sweeping it through the air. The bird banked through the air, narrowly avoiding the blades of wind. One scored a long, shallow gash on its stomach, and Temari's eyes narrowed as the gash sealed itself. Obviously the ninja could repair the puppet somehow, which would make things a little harder. Then she spotted the object winging its way towards her. It was a smaller bird. Clay-colored again, she noted. She swung her fan, sending several blades towards it, but it managed to dodge them. Her opponent clearly had some experience fighting in the air, but he was badly mistaken if he thought he could best her in her element. She spread the fan slightly, then curled it as she swept it through the air again. The bird tired dodge only to find itself flung backwards as a wall of air slammed into it. "Katsu!" She heard the other ninja call out. The moment she heard the first syllable, she yanked on the fan she was riding, gaining extra distance from the bird. As expected, the thing exploded, but with the extra distance she just had to ride out the turbulence as the explosion rippled through the air. She swept the skies again, making sure to watch carefully for the birds this time. There was already another one coming towards her, and the larger bird the ninja was riding was trying to gain altitude as it circled her. She sent another wall of air towards the small bird, sending it tumbling, but this time the ninja didn't activate the exploding tag. He released another bird, then another, even as he himself fought to gain still more altitude. In response, Temari began sending out a mixture of blunt and sharp attacks, stunning and then cutting apart the birds. Even as she dealt with those, she began climbing higher herself, not wanting to give her opponent the height advantage. The larger bird banked sharply again, this time heading straight for her, and the ninja flung his hands out. It wasn't birds this time, though. Instead, it was a lot of little objects that were almost too small to make out. Judging by everything else he'd done, however, it was a safe bet that they would explode, and she definitely didn't want any part of that. Her arms started to ache as it strained to pull the fan through the air as fast as possible, sending gusts of air above and around her that kept the small objects, spiders, well away from her. She noted that the ninja was floating above her, moving in a small circle as he watched her fend off his latest attack. His hands were busy, no doubt creating more of these things, and he was standing at a slight angle as he tilted the bird to allow a better look. She grinned to herself, and in the midst of dealing with the spiders she sent two blades whistling towards him. One to where he would be in a moment, and one to the only place he could safely dodge in time. He cursed as he saw the attack coming and turned the bird almost sideways as he increased the speed and degree of his turn, and then cursed again when the second blade of wind sheared off one of the bird's wings. He clung to the bird as it began tumbling through the air, his hand pushing against its body as he scrambled to do something. Temari raised her fan again, a vicious smirk on her face as she prepared to destroy the upstart who dared challenge her in the sky, and then she felt the warning again, the same one that had saved her life earlier. This time she wasn't fast enough to react. Something slammed into her back, and she could feel her spine bending almost too far and several ribs cracking as she was launched forward, off of her fan. As she tumbled through the air, the wind whipping at her clothes and whistling in her ears, she caught glimpses of a girl with 6 green wings streaking towards the ninja she had been fighting. She had managed to maintain her hold on her smaller fan, and she swept it desperately back and forth as she oriented herself and began trying to slow her descent. The ground was approaching awfully fast, rising to meet her, and she didn't think she'd be able to slow down in time. Then she wasn't thinking anything at all. 3:20 a.m. Thanks, Deidara panted as Fu lowered him to the ground. The large bird he had been riding lay nearby, its right wing still only half formed from where he had managed to repair it before Fu grabbed him. No problem, Fu responded, slowly calming down as the thrill of fear and adrenaline drained out of her. Her arms tightened around his waist momentarily, and she looked up at his face as if to convince herself that he was really fine. Deidara stared down at her for several seconds, either saying anything, then he abruptly looked away and cleared his throat. "How is Kisame-dana doing?" Deidara asked, gently loosening her arms. Fu stepped back regretfully, disappointed that the embrace was ending but thrilled with what she'd seen in his eyes before he looked away. He hadn't disliked it, not at all. "I think he's trying to drown the Ichibi, judging by how much water he's flinging around. He must have been draining a ton of chakra off the thing to get that much." "Good so far, then," Deidara nodded, moving back to his bird and resuming his work on the damaged wing. "Now that the sister's been taken care of, we should have free rein to strike from above. We need to finish this up before any reinforcements get here." "All right," Fu nodded. "See you up above," she said, grinning, before she spread her wings and took to the air. She flitted back and forth, simply reveling in the feeling of being in the air for a moment, then focused on the fighting below. Kisame was jumping around on top of the water, the sheer volume of which was approaching a small lake by this point, held in place by a combination of the terrain and a lot of chakra, easily dodging the strikes the Ichibi launched from the edge of the lake. Even as she watched, another massive wall of water rose up behind the beast and slammed into it, sending it tumbling into the lake despite its attempts to hold firm. Kisame ran forward, his sword raised, then suddenly paused. After a moment, he abruptly started pulling water out of the lake and forming some sort of attack above his head. Rather than doing anything with it, though, he just kept adding more and more water. She couldn't see the Ichibi at all, and was starting to wonder if it actually was possible to drown a bijou when a sharp crack resounded from down below, echoing off the nearby mountains for several seconds as the sound slowly diminished. Kisame started pulling water into his attack even faster, but she didn't see anything happening aside from that at first. Then she noted that the water level was dropping far faster than Kisame's attack could account for, the water draining downward where it had refused to spread sideways. Deidara joined her a moment later, his clay bird flapping its wings lazily as he circled nearby. "What's happening? What was that sound, I'm not sure," Fu said slowly, staring at the rapidly disappearing water, "but I think the Jinchuriki just cracked open the ground to drain the water away." Deidara whistled lowly. "Bet Kisame-dana's pissed about that one," he muttered. Below, Kisame seemed to be looking around, still keeping the massive ball of water he had managed to salvage suspended above him. He abruptly leapt into the air, avoiding the gaping maw of the Ichibi as it snapped closed where he had been standing moments before, the teeth falling just shy of his feet. He swung his sword down, sending the water spiraling at the Ichibi. The tip of the attack was spinning like a drill, but failed to pierce the outer layer of the Ichibi. Undaunted, Kisame readied his sword as he fell towards the beast. Fu turned to see Deidara grinning at her. "Care to give me a lift, he asked. "I think Kisame-dana might have a better use for my ride here than I do, Fu matched his grin as she wrapped her arms around his waist again, and he wrapped his arms around her shoulders, making sure to not interfere with her wings. The bird he had been riding swept forward and began diving through the air, streaking towards the Ichibi's form where it was battling Kisame. Kisame saw the attack coming, and rather than dodging the next swipe of the Ichibi's claws blocked with Samahata, allowing the attack to launch him away. The bird splattered against the stone construct, spreading to cover nearly a third of its form, and Deidara slowly raised one hand, an excited shiver running through his frame. Art is a bang on. Katsu, ever as far away as they were, the shockwave slammed into Fu hard, sending her tumbling through the air for several seconds. Her grip tightened on Deidara, though not so hard that she actually hurt him. After a few moments she leveled off and began slowly floating to the ground. She could get them there faster, sure, but then she'd have to put Deidara down faster. Slow and steady it was. That was a good one, Deidara said, his voice satisfied as his eyes surveyed the damage. Foot turned to look as well. The area where the Ichibi had been standing was a charred and smoking crater. She could make out pieces of what might have been its claws and possibly its tails, scattered around the area. But there was nothing left that resembled the tailed beast that had been battling Deidara. What was left was a large ball of stone that appeared to be slowly dissolving into sand. She floated closer as a red-haired ninja tumbled out of the sand, landing on his hands and knees with an audible groan. He slowly struggled to his feet, his face rising to stare at her with an expression of absolute hatred and loathing. Fu could see Kisame approaching from the west, Samahata wrapped up again and hefted over his shoulder. Before any of them could do anything further, something wrong washed over them, disrupting Fu's control and sending both her and Deidara tumbling the last few feet to the ground. She shot to her feet, prepared to fight off whatever it was, only to see nothing in any direction. The only thing she could make out was the light of dawn starting to creep over the horizon to the northeast. There was no enemy, no technique about to assault their position. Nothing. Then another wave of that wrongness hit, making her stumble once again. She saw Gaara falling back to his knees as well, both hands clutching at his head. Kisame and Deidara didn't seem affected, but both were staring to the northeast, their eyes narrowed. She looked again, wondering what had them so stunned. It took her several seconds before she realized that what she had initially thought was the beginnings of dawn on the horizon couldn't be. Dawn was still hours away. That meant that the glow that seemed to light up the night had to be a massive blaze of some sort. In the middle of a rocky plain, 3:00 a.m., 1 kilometer east of Iwabikure. It was about an hour after the barrier surrounding Iwa fell that Kusha sensed a familiar signature approaching rapidly, that of the resurrected form of Minato Namikaze. It was likely that Orochimaru was targeting him once again, but despite that knowledge his focus was drawn to the signature accompanying him. This other signature was, while not all that strong, far and away the oddest he had ever sensed. It was foul and twisted and only vaguely human, yet he could sense dozens, maybe hundreds, of distinct human signatures within it. Unlike the resurrection technique that Orochimaru favored, where the signatures, though there was only one this time, he noted, were subsumed and melded into what he assumed was some approximation of Minato Namikaze's chakra signature as it had been in life. This other being had no separate signature, or perhaps it would be better to say that its signature was that of the hundreds within it. The second ninja, whoever it was, stopped about 2 kilometers away while Orochimaru continued to approach, his speed actually increasing. Kusha readied himself for battle, increasing the flow of his yuki and reinforcing his limbs. Orochimaru's speed increased further, and then further still. The other ninja who had remained in the outpost once the battle started, mostly messengers who focused on their speed and stamina, turned as they sensed the approaching ninja, the chakra being used to increase his speed reaching levels that they could detect even without being sensors. They had foregone the use of torches or other light sources, both to avoid revealing their position as well as preserve their night vision, and most were utilizing the All-Sight Jutsu to boost it even further. In theory they should be able to identify any approaching threats nearly as well as they could in daylight. The closest died, their bodies ripped apart by the swirling orbs of energy held in Minato's hands, before they had finished turning to look. Their blood splashed across the nearby walls and even their fellow ninja, forming darker patches amongst the ground in the pale light provided by the moon. Kushu, even with the warning provided by his senses, found himself hard-pressed to react as the white blur raced in his direction. Rasengan met Rasengan once more, but unlike before Orochimaru was not repelled. Instead Kushu felt the angles of attack shifting rapidly, forcing his hands and arms wide and making him scramble to avoid the attacks pressing on him. He channeled chakra and yuki into the ground, changing dirt into mud that tried to suck in any foot that stepped upon it, stone into spikes that lanced upwards, and hurling rocks in every direction in an effort to strike the resurrected Hokage. Every attempt was avoided or destroyed, the puppet driving him back even more, his efforts with his own Rasengan barely serving to protect him. The other ninja, the 7 still surviving, split up. 4 leapt forward to join in the fight while 3 began to run out of the base, each choosing a direction that would allow them to reach reinforcements and spread word of another attack. 2 of those attempting to leave died as kunai sank into their skulls, and the third was torn apart as Orochimaru briefly broke off his attack to deal with them. The other four fared no better, and Kusha made no move to assist or protect them, instead focusing his efforts on his next attack. Orochimaru, still moving fast enough that Kusha could barely track his form visually, turned once more and closed the distance between them. Just before he reached melee range, the air around him exploded, a swirling tornado of fire forming out of midair. Kusha added sweeping wind blades to the attack, threatening to cut his foe apart as well as providing even more fuel to the fire. Orochimaru responded with an unknown wind technique that ripped the tornado apart from the inside out despite Kusha's attempts to reform it. His opponent chose to resume his direct assault rather than shifting to ninjutsu, however, and Kusha found himself fending off the Rasengan once more. Ripping the earth apart beneath the man's feet barely slowed him, and even the lightning techniques he attempted to use were avoided or neutralized with disgusting ease. The man was attacking with a single-minded purpose and incredible focus, and even forming nearly a dozen clones and rapidly using Kawarimi to swap places with several of them did not throw the man off. He was seriously contemplating manifesting his Yuki despite his exposed position when Orochimaru finally slipped through his guard. All it took was the smallest opening, his arm getting forced a little too wide after blocking an attack. Orochimaru twisted his arm sharply, the blow that had been aimed at his shoulder suddenly shifting to target his stomach instead, and the first true blow of the battle landed. The Rasengan tore through his flak jacket as if it were paper, his reinforced skin faring no better. The sphere left a bloody froze several inches long before he could twist enough to get away from it, and he began healing the damage even as he prepared to fend off the follow-up, which never came. Minato's body stopped moving, standing across from him with a wide grin on its face. An earth clone formed from the ground between them, chuckling to itself before suddenly leaving in a shunshin. Kusha tracked the clone, noting that it was heading directly for the other signature that had accompanied Orochimaru earlier. What was the point of that? You are very good, Orochimaru said, sounding like he was genuinely impressed. Not only have you regained full use of the arm I detached earlier, but you managed to keep up with me for a time without calling upon those fascinating chakra limbs. Kusha didn't respond, instead trying to wrap the earth beneath the puppet around it, trapping it. Orochimaru shifted abruptly, briefly blurring before he was standing several meters away, and the earth closed around empty air. You also have an incredible utility. A much larger patch of earth attempted the same maneuver with just as little success, with sealless jutsu. It has been a very long time since I've seen the like. Tell me, how did you manage it? Kusha stared at him for several seconds. This fight was not going at all the way he had anticipated, and he found that he didn't care for the experience. He started pushing more Yuki out of the seal, accepting that the abilities that he normally used were not going to be sufficient here. He could utilize nearly double the Yuki he had been using up to this point, with the associated increase in his range to match, and after seeing how easily Orochimaru negated his attacks it seemed he would need it. As he did so, he finally deigned to reply to Orochimaru. Practice, he said, smirking. I imagine you acquired your skill at violating corpses the same way. Orochimaru just chuckled. Yes, he hissed. I suppose you have noticed how much greater my control over this form is. It was a mistake to split my attention, I see that now. Focus, familiarity, those are the keys to unlocking the power of this technique. The clone that had left earlier had reached the second ninja and dispelled itself after a few seconds, whatever message it carried delivered. The other ninja still wasn't moving though. I've learned a bit more about you, Kushin noted. I'm surprised you are willing to admit that other ninja are so superior to you, that you would use their forms over your own. Like so many others, you failed to see the true genius of what I have accomplished, Orochimaru retorted. No techniques can be hidden from me, no style can remain beyond my reach. I can utilize the form best suited for whatever task I desire, for as long as I need, with no risk to myself. My own skill does not dull, but instead grows. Wounds that would destroy lesser ninja are nothing to me. Kusha flexed his body's hands, feeling the body quivering under the strain of containing his Yuki. He lay coiled, ready to spring forth and destroy this body just as he had before. Orochimaru had grown faster, but not so fast that he could not respond at all. He twisted his Yuki, then began filtering it into the ground, spreading it out in all directions. Orochimaru did not react, even when the Yuki flowed directly under his feet and beyond. His next strike would not be so easily avoided. Kusha was distracted from his task when he felt the chakra of the second ninja suddenly shift. It wasn't the sort of shift he would associate with someone reinforcing their body, or even preparing a technique, however. Instead, the entire signature suddenly altered, all of the disparate signatures unifying into a single signature, then changing into he didn't know what. It felt both more and less human-like than it had before, simultaneously like how he would expect a human to feel and the exact opposite. The new signature also seemed very odd, like he should know it, and yet he couldn't place who it belonged to. Still, it doesn't matter, Orochimaru said after a moment when he failed to respond. Despite your valiant struggles and impressive skill, this is as far as you go. It is your misfortune to be more useful to me dead than alive. Kushu turned his attention back to Orochimaru, grinning at the man's arrogance. You haven't managed to kill me yet. As I recall, I tore you to pieces the last time, and He abruptly stumbled as he felt something piercing his leg. He looked down, expecting to find a kunai or some other weapon sticking out of him, and wondering how he had missed the attack, only to see nothing. Just a ragged hole nearly an inch across sticking completely through the middle of his thigh. Despite the lack of any physical object, his flesh was behaving like something was there, pushing and twisting against thin air as if it was a solid barrier. Even the blood was held back like something was blocking it, though it leaked out around the edges of the hole. He placed one hand over the wound, encountering no resistance. He even pushed into the wound slightly, his hand finding nothing and yet his leg still acting like something was there. Just as abruptly as it had appeared, the phantom object withdrew, gouging his leg and scraping bone as it moved. Blood started flowing freely now, and Kushu quickly set to work fixing the damage even as his focus returned to Orochimaru. What sort of technique is this? He growled. Orochimaru, on the other hand, looked fascinated. A very unique one, he murmured. Tell me, what do you feel? Can you describe the sensations? How does it interact with your body? The phantom object abruptly stabbed into his stomach, pulling and twisting and tearing as the tip moved about drunkenly. Do you find it more or less painful to be wounded in this fashion? Orochimaru continued, his eyes glinting. Frowning, Kushu realized that he couldn't feel Orochimaru's chakra doing anything, and that he felt the second ninja's pulsing wildly. You aren't doing this, Kushu said suddenly, his eyes widening. How? The object withdrew again, leaving his stomach to dig into his arm a moment later, starting at the elbow and then dragging downwards. It would be difficult to fight like this, even if he could correct the damage almost as quickly as it was caused. It worried him more that he couldn't sense how this was being accomplished, however. He rapidly withdrew his yuki from the ground, returning it to his body in preparation. I don't know yet, Orochimaru admitted candidly, but I will be finding out in time. So many things to research still. His eyes grew distant, seeming to dismiss his presence entirely as he became lost in thought. Kushu burst into motion the next moment, using a shunshin to rapidly close the distance between himself and the second ninja. He stumbled and fell before he was even halfway there. His left foot was torn apart, and Orochimaru was upon him a moment later. Kukukuku, he laughed. Such vitality. Do you know if this is common among all Jinchuriki? Is your accelerated healing inherent in your condition? The object withdrew from his foot and slammed into his chest, opening a hole in the middle of his heart. Alas! Orochimaru muttered quietly. It seems my questions will have to wait for another time. Kushu slumped back against the ground, his eyes growing glassy as he stared at the sky. Then he was blinded by a bright yellow flash, and the smell of burnt flesh assaulted his senses even as something landed on top of him. 3:00 a.m. 20 kilometers northeast of Iwagakure. Ino remained still as she awoke, trying to determine what had pulled her from her sleep. There were a few other ninja in the barracks, tossing and turning and snoring as they took what rest they could, but she had long ago learned how to filter out those sorts of sounds. There was no one moving around, no one trying to sneak up on her, and the door was still closed. Despite all of that, something was wrong. She pulled herself up, tapping the floor in a quick signal to wake the other ninja. Flaring her chakra might draw notice, and shaking them directly would almost certainly get her a kunai or two for her trouble, so noise would have to do. The others woke quickly as the rhythmic sound filtered through their dreams, all of them as still and silent as she had been. She found a jounin standing beside her a moment later, a long scar on one side of her face pulling the side of her mouth into a permanent frown. What is it, Yamanaka? The woman asked quietly, scanning the room. Something's wrong. The woman's frown deepened, but she nodded. She knew all too well that you ignored a ninja's instincts at your own peril. You're with me, then rest of you pair off and get ready. We can get back to sleep once we've confirmed that the outpost is secure. The woman stalked towards the door, moving low, her footsteps completely silent. She paused at the door for a moment, then slowly pulled it open. The night was quiet and still, their outposts, meant to serve as reinforcements for the reinforcements, far enough away from the fighting that they couldn't even detect the massive surges of chakra that marked the battle for IWA. Ino paused, shaking her head. There was a slight buzzing in her head, an odd sensation that she'd never felt before. What? You hear something? The Jounin asked. No, but she paused, noting that the buzzing was getting stronger and starting to pick up definition. It wasn't a sound at all, actually, but a bundle of sensations. When she focused on it, tried to really understand what she was sensing, it suddenly became understandable. It was oddly muted, but she could practically see it in her mind, a smoking mountain shaking with barely restrained fury, its molten rage spilling forth from cracks up and down its height, advancing across the torn and twisted landscape. It covered hills and valleys, rivers and forests alike in a slow, inevitable march, its approach as unstoppable as the tides of the ocean or a storm covering the sky. And underlying it all was a sense of bottomless depths, of a great well of power without limit. She'd never felt something like this before, and yet she had, something within her telling her that she should know what this was. And she thought she did. It reminded her of, "Oh Kami," she breathed. "It's a Jinchuriki. A Jinchuriki is coming." The woman stared at her for a moment, then her eyes widened and she started flaring her chakra and shouting at the top of her lungs as she moved away to alert everyone else. The camp exploded into activity, the guards who had been awake already scrambling to locate the source of the attack while those who had been resting threw themselves out of their beds, most of them ready almost as quickly as they had remained fully clothed, most merely needing to attach their pouches and bits of armor before they joined the guards. Then a torrent of lava lanced through the outpost, dividing it in half even as the buildings caught fire and Ninja began screaming in fear and agony. Ino snapped out of her trance and scrambled to reach higher ground, moving away from the heat. She scanned the area to the east, knowing that was where the source of the attack was, even as another arc of lava spewed forth, almost seeming to emerge directly from the ground. It swept towards the outpost, leaving a trail of heat and devastation as it cut through the outpost again. Ninja were moving in that direction now, their chakra flaring in anger as they responded to the attack. The bundle of sensation in her head suddenly pulsed, and she tried to scream at the ninja to fall back, but she was too late. Instead of lava, a towering inferno seemed to spring out of midair, twisting and growing as it grew wider and wider. It towered hundreds of feet in the air and was already easily twice as wide, but still it continued to grow as it advanced across the rocky terrain. Water slammed into the wall, trying to douse it, and earth tried to smother it, but to no effect. The ninja began retreating, abandoning their attack as they fled, taking their injured comrades and what supplies they could salvage as they did so. Ino moved to join them, then stumbled and fell as the sensation suddenly pulsed again, stronger than ever before. A loud roar ripped through the night, and beyond the wall of fire that was still advancing she could see a large form rising up, four tails flailing behind it, and two massive arms stretching towards the sky. Then the two hands joined together, the fingers interwoven and the muscles bulging, and she knew what was about to happen, knew as clearly as if someone had whispered it into her ear. Her hands began flashing through hand signs faster than they ever had before, her eyes wide and her breath coming in terrified pants. She wasn't fast enough to escape this on foot, none of them were. Akai's hands swept down, cutting through the air faster than anything that large had a right to, and slammed into the ground with an earth-shaking boom. Ino whimpered even as her hands moved faster, praying desperately that she could make it in time. The ground below erupted, lava spewing in all directions and turning the rocky terrain into a simmering cauldron of molten earth. She felt the building beneath her give way, her leg making contact with something that caused a flash of pain that ended far too quickly, and something else that scraped across her back, leaving a trail of raw agony carved into it. Her body screamed in pain, but she pushed through it, not daring to slow or even stop. Then she completed the last hand sign. She remained in the void for several seconds, her eyes screwed shut and her body trembling. Slowly, she allowed herself to feel out the connections to the Horatian seals. One led her back to her current position, and she shuddered when she saw just how close she was to being swallowed up by a column of lava. The thing that had scraped across her back was another such column, and if she had been a meter further to the left, or if the building hadn't given way, she would have been swallowed by it completely. She tried not to look at her leg, reassuring herself that Naruto could fix that. He'd stuck his own arm back on, so surely that wasn't any worse. Her mind flitted to the other seals, most of the ones in Konoha still in the same place, though the 3 tattooed on people were actually in IWA now as their bearers fought. The 7 that had been in IWA before were moving, actually. They were stuck in a box with a large assortment of other items, already several kilometers north of IWA and almost a full kilometer underground. She could make out several ninja in the immediate area, all of them young and grim-faced and a couple even crying. Then there was Kushina's seal, which showed the woman somewhere along the coast far to the east, dressed in A&BU-style gear in the middle of cutting another ninja in half, this one Akuma missing Nin from his forehead protector. And then she focused on the seal Naruto had inscribed on himself, on his bones actually, which she still found a little disgusting, and had to stifle a scream. He was lying on his back on the ground, blood covering most of his form and a giant hole in the middle of his chest, sticking straight through his heart. His purple eyes were open and staring vacantly at the moonlit sky above him. A blond man in a white trench coat who looked oddly familiar was standing next to him, smirking. She forced herself to calm. Naruto's body was irrelevant. Something like that couldn't kill him. He was faking for some reason, likely to lure the man off guard for an attack of his own. In fact, now that her attention had been drawn to it, she could make out another bundle of sensations in her head, distinct from what she had felt from the Jinchuriki. Curious, and knowing she had the time to really examine it, she focused on it. At first, she couldn't even tell that she was getting anything from it, but then she realized that the empty expanse she was currently floating in was still and silent, while the one she felt in her head was pulsing slowly, like someone's heartbeat. She shifted uncomfortably, shrugging her shoulders. Something had changed, but she couldn't tell what. The image she was getting seemed empty and still, a stark and confusing contrast to the violent energy she had felt from Akai. Was it because she was in the middle of the Hiraishin technique? Then it pulsed again. She hunched slightly, wondering why she felt so heavy. Then it pulsed again, and something shifted. The black emptiness that surrounded her seemed to ripple, darkness flowing across darkness, a contrast of nothing that screamed out at her. Then it pulsed again, faster and faster, and she felt herself being drawn towards something. She shouldn't be able to measure movement, as there was nothing to measure against, but she knew was getting closer to something. And as she did, the heaviness became crushing, her body feeling like it was being flattened and stretched out, her every effort meaningless in the face of the force that now had control of her. And she knew, just like she had known that Akai's lava would spread to cover everything in time, that the something she was being drawn towards would never stop until it had consumed everything in its path. She pulled back from the image, swallowing thickly. She knew what Naruto had meant by the burning sky is a lie, now. His real power, the part of him that was unique from the other Bijou, had nothing to do with fire at all. Ino drew in a deep breath and let it out, bringing her focus back to the here and now. She needed healing if she was going to do anything, and that meant Naruto. With a thought, she pulled on that thread and vanished. 3:15 a.m. 2 kilometers east of Iwagakure. Orochimaru's eyes narrowed as he took in the girl who had just appeared out of nowhere in a yellow flash. He knew what she must have done, but for her to have access to the technique that had so long eluded his grasp, that could not be allowed to stand. The girl whimpered, one hand reaching out to clutch at the Jinchuriki's shirt. She had been badly burned, and every movement twisted and pulled at her injuries. She let out a sudden gasp, and then his hand was around her throat, lifting her into the air. "How do you know that technique?" he snarled, focusing his killing intent. Her eyes, surprisingly clear and cogent considering the pain she must be in, stared defiantly back at him. Then, before he could even say another word, the life faded from them abruptly, her body going slack. He stared at her for a few more seconds, unable to believe that the moment he found a potential source for the Hiraishin she died on him. With a disgusted sneer he tossed the body aside, refocusing on. Kushu stood, eyeing the dissolving remains of the construct Orochimaru had been using for a moment, then moving towards Ino's body. He felt rage coursing through his body as he saw how injured she had been, and in that moment made his decision. He knelt, pulling out a sealing scroll and placing her body within it. He pulled out a small capsule, sealed the scroll and the pouches he wore within that, then swallowed it. Unless his entire body was destroyed, the capsule and everything in it would survive what was to come. His head swiveled to the east for a moment, noting the location of the signature that had accompanied Orochimaru and was the likely source of the phantom weapon that was even now stuck inside his chest. Then he looked to the north, where he could see the distant glowing flames created by Akai's Jinchuriki. Yuki poured from his body, swirling chaotically around his frame, and snaps and cracks filled the air as his form twisted and bent. His arms writhed as bones shifted and muscles grew, and his legs bent unnaturally as new joints took shape. He shed his sandals as his feet outgrew them, his new claws digging deep into the earth. The transformation continued for nearly a minute, and when it was done, what stood in the clearing bore little resemblance to his former shape. He was covered in blood-red fur, his thickly muscled legs bent as he crouched. His hands ended in razor-sharp claws, and his arms were every bit as muscled as his legs. His head had also changed. It was covered in fur, his blonde hair nowhere in sight. Long pointed ears swept back from his skull, and his face had shifted to form a long snout. His mouth parted for a moment, revealing dozens of sharp, gleaming teeth. 9 tails of Yuki emerged from the base of his spine, sweeping through the air in agitation. His eyes, fully red except for black, slit-like pupils, seemed to be burning with some inner fire as his gaze turned to the east once again. One clawed hand brushed across his chest, sliding across the hole that still remained, though the wound had stopped leaking blood. He exhaled, the air leaving his chest with a low rumble, and tensed. He paused for a moment, his head cocked to the side, and breathed out another gust of air in a sharp snort. "Would you stop about the fur already?" he said to the empty clearing. Then he leapt, his clawed feet leaving deep furrows in the ground as he vanished from the clearing in a swirl of dust and Yuki. Chapter 50, Snake Eyes, Part 3. April 21st, 348 NE, -3:20 AM, -3 kilometers east of Iwagakure. Kusha honed in on the strange chakra signature, his form blurring as he raced over the rocky ground. His claws left gouges in the stone as he ran, and he left a trail of shattered stone behind him as the force of his movement proved to be more than the terrain could handle. When he was close enough, he leapt to the top of a rock outcropping and paused for a moment, his legs coiling and his muscles tensing. Drawn on the ground in blood was a large circle, and on the inside of the circle was a triangle, also drawn in blood. It wasn't a Fuinjutsu circle, but he could sense the ninja's chakra flowing through it all the same. His target was stretched out on the ground within the circle, a spear of some kind sticking out of his chest. As far as he could tell, the wound matched up with the hole that still remained in his own body, providing some insight into just how this strange technique functioned. The ninja himself was liberally painted, most of his body pitch black except for thick white lines that gave the impression of bones. His face was painted to resemble a skull, though his gray hair remained visible. And despite the fact that the ninja's heart must have been destroyed as surely as his own, he was still alive. "Fuck!" the ninja suddenly shouted, sitting up and pulling the spear out of his chest. Kusha felt the phantom weapon withdraw from his own chest at the same time, confirming that this ninja was indeed responsible for what had been happening, somehow. "Jashin-sama!" the man called out, his voice piteous. "How have I failed you? Why do you withhold your blessing from me?" Kusha blinked as the man continued to cry out to the heavens, then shook his head. Whatever the ninja was talking about was going to be irrelevant in a moment. He crouched lower, his claws digging in for extra purchase, then launched himself forward. The ninja barely had time to turn before Kusha rocketed into him, carrying him out of the circle. Even as he made contact, he could feel something slamming into his own gut, his ribs snapping despite the fact that his body should have been able to withstand much more than that. The moment the ninja lost contact with the circle, however, the man's signature abruptly returned to the chaotic combination of hundreds of different signatures, and the paint covering his body vanished. Kusha noted that the phantom pressure working against his own form disappeared at the same time. "The fuck is this bullshit?" the ninja shouted as he rolled to his feet. He reached behind himself and pulled a weapon off of his back, revealing a triple-bladed scythe. "First Jashin-sama doesn't accept my sacrifice, and now fucking animals are interrupting me?" Then the ninja paused, his eyes straying to the 9 tails whipping through the air behind Kusha. "Oh fu!" The tails lanced forward, piercing through the ninja's torso, legs, and arms before they wrapped around him and started slowly pulling. Sure," the man wheezed, before with one final heave Kusha separated his tails, spreading the ninja across the clearing in a burst of blood and gore. Kusha let out a low growl as he stretched out his senses. The ninja's twisted signature was slowly dissipating, but there were 2 other signatures in the area, one high above and another approaching from the southeast along the ground. Both were exceptionally powerful, but he didn't recognize either of them. The one above began to withdraw, heading north, while the one on the ground was stopped as it began fighting for other signatures that he didn't recognize. It didn't matter to him, though. He had business elsewhere. He turned to the north and left with another burst of speed. Hyden groaned to himself after the Kyuubi Jinchuriki had left. It had been a long time since he'd been hurt to this extent. It was going to take hours to pull himself back together. Hopefully that Konan bitch or that fucker Orochimaru would show up and hurry things along. He was still using his jaw to move his head closer to his nearest body part when he heard someone else approaching. "Hey! Konan! Orochimaru! Whoever the fuck you are! Quit fucking around and put me back together, you asshole!" He rolled his head over to find that the person who had arrived was not one of the members of his so-called team, but a tall, thin ninja dressed entirely in black. Most of his face was covered by a mask, but he had a forehead protector that marked him as a missing nin from Taki. "The fuck are you looking at, asshole?" Haiden shouted. The ninja didn't say anything, instead walking over to one of his body parts and picking it up. "Hey! The shit are you doing with my leg, dickwad?" The ninja didn't say anything as he continued to collect pieces and began sealing them into scrolls. "I'm fucking talking to your stupid ass, jack off." Finally, the man was standing over his head, staring down at him with expressionless, pale green eyes. His hand reached down and picked up his head by his hair. "Put me down, asshole. As soon as I get put back together, I am going to." "My bounties usually have the courtesy to shut up when they are torn apart," the man growled as he sealed Haiden's head inside another scroll. He put the various scrolls away, then pulled out a small list and a brush, marking through one of the names on the scroll. Then he turned and began making his way south. Kushu allowed his focus to drift inward slightly as his body continued streaking across the terrain. "Who the fuck was that?" Ino asked. "And what did he do to piss you off that bad?" He grinned, his fox-like Yuki form revealing long, sharp teeth, as he turned to answer Ino, and blinked. "What?" he heard Ino ask. Heard but couldn't see. Or clearly sense, for that matter. Every time he tried to focus on her signature he could feel his senses sliding past her, only picking up just enough to know that something was there. He could feel her presence in the seal as clearly as he had every other time she used the Yamanaka technique on him, but for some reason her exact location eluded him. "What are you doing?" he asked curiously. "Doing? I'm asking a question," she responded, a bit of annoyance filtering into her tone. Kushu spread out his Yuki, letting it drift around the seal and noting where it encountered resistance. He eventually found a space where his Yuki seemed to flow around nothing, his senses telling him the area was empty even as it became clear something was there. "Hey! What are you doing? You really aren't doing anything?" "No!" Ino snapped. "Why?" "Because I'm having trouble sensing you, for some reason." Ino was silent for a moment. "Really?" she asked curiously. Her signature lessened to the point where she almost vanished completely, then returned to its previous state. "Why? Were you thinking of hiding just then?" Kushu asked, understanding beginning to dawn. "Well, yeah. You just said you couldn't sense me, of course I was." Even as she said it, her signature almost vanished again. "Try thinking of becoming visible." Her signature spiked even as she asked, "What's the point of that?" "Just focus on it," he replied. "Fine," she muttered, and her signature grew and stabilized. As it did, her form became visible, partly at least. She was standing on his back, as she normally did when she was here, her arms crossed over her chest and a look of concentration on her face. Even though he could see some of her now, her form was still partially invisible, the edges between visible and not shimmering and shifting randomly. Unlike every other time she'd been inside the seal, however, her eyes were a deep, glowing purple, looking exactly like they did when she was calling on her own nascent Yuki. With that, he realized that this was actually the first time she had used one of the Yamanaka jutsu on him since he had made his changes. "Well, isn't that interesting?" he muttered, trying to focus on her signature to see if he could glean any further details. It kept slipping away from him, but there was enough to further his understanding of what was happening. In the meantime, Ina looked down at herself then back up at him, her brow furrowed. "Isn't what interesting? What do you look like to yourself?" "Like normal," she said slowly. "Why?" Rather than answering directly, he formed an image of what she looked like to him, showing it to her. Her jaw dropped open and her signature nearly vanished as she lost focus. "Holy shit! That's badass!" she shouted, laughing. "Is that really what I look like?" He watched as her form rapidly shifted, parts fading in and out of view while her eyes seemed to glow brighter and brighter. He shifted the image he was displaying to match, and she finally settled on a state where her body was completely hidden except for her eyes. Two glowing points of purple hanging in midair that flickered and coiled as if burning with some inner fire. A shimmering outline of her body slowly faded into view as well, providing some sense of her posture and stance. "Oh hell yes," she muttered, her wide grin clearly audible in her voice. After a few more seconds spent admiring the image, the eyes shifted to him, narrowing and sharpening as they focused. An outline of her body flickered in and out of view, taking on a purple tinge to match her eyes. He could feel her signature shifting already. There was the sense of an invisible predator ghosting through empty terrain, watching his every movement and seeing straight through every ruse and attempt to evade them. "So what's going on?" she asked. "Does this have something to do with my Yuki?" "It does indeed," he answered, pleased that she already had a decent grasp of the situation. "I think your power is starting to show itself." The eyes flared, and her form flickered into full view for a moment to reveal the pleased grin on her face before it faded again. Speaking of powers, she said, I felt something from Akai earlier, and from you, for that matter. Kusha nodded, smiling widely. What you are sensing is what Bijou feel like to each other. What did you sense? Akai was like a volcano, a really, really angry volcano. And you? I'm still not sure what that was. Akai always did have something of a temper, Kusha said, snorting at the understatement. It sounds like you got a pretty good read on him. What about me? I thought it was the void, at first, she admitted. Close, Kusha said, nodding for her to continue. It wasn't empty like the void, though. There was something there that I couldn't see, then I was getting drawn towards something, then something was squeezing me. Anything else? At the end, like with Akai, where I got the impression that the lava was going to cover everything, I got the distinct impression that whatever it was would consume everything. It's possible, certainly, though highly unlikely, he noted, smirking. I figured. It's not like a volcano is going to spew out enough lava to cover the entire world either. What I don't get, though, is why Akai's image felt so washed out. Washed out? Kusha asked slowly, remembering the traces he had felt back in Taki. Yeah. I could sense everything pretty clearly, but at the same time it was like it half wasn't there. Even as she spoke, his attention began to return to the outside world, where his body was closing in on the Jinchuriki. He could feel Akai's power being slung about, feel the magma shifting under the earth as it responded to his call. He could sense the same washed-out impression that Ino had mentioned. Unlike her, he knew what was missing. Inside the seal, his form lost cohesion as his Yuki surged. It slammed against the walls of the seal, cracks spreading like spiderwebs along the formerly pristine white walls as the seal strained against him. Ino yelped as she was dropped to the floor, the sound lost in the low rumble that was rapidly building to a crescendo. Yuki poured from his body, surrounding him in a cocoon of energy. His tails whipped back and forth in a frenzy, stretching and growing along with his rage. After a moment, his entire body tensed and he roared, his Yuki unconsciously fueling the sound as it spread like a shockwave across the battlefield. All movement ceased for a moment, ninja from every side pausing as they felt something washing over them. The ninja from Konoha who had been present in the village 12 years ago shivered, recognizing the feeling for what it was and wondering just what had happened. The next moment he flung himself forward, streaking through the air like a fiery comet. The Jinchuriki had manifested a mockery of Akai's form and was slinging its thick, heavily muscled arms about, streams of lava bursting out of the ground at every movement. The tails were whipping through the air behind him, but seemed to be moving without any sort of purpose. There were ninjas scrambling desperately before it, evading its attacks and trying to launch their own counters even as they fell back. With one last bound he leapt into the air behind the Jinchuriki and slammed into the gigantic form. The ape-like construct staggered sideways and began roaring in pain as his claws and tails began ripping through the chakra that made up its body. Chakra, not Yuki. It was unmistakably Akai's power, but there was nothing of Akai himself left within it. Akatsuki had finally succeeded in creating their perfect weapon, somehow crafting a seal that stripped the power from a bijou without leaving anything of the bijou itself behind. He could feel Akai buried within the seal, his presence greatly diminished after all of the power that had been ripped away from him over the years. The Jinchuriki began clawing at him, the hands of the ape-like form trying to pull him off or smash him to the ground, but he was already beneath the skin and was rapidly digging deeper and deeper into the construct, aiming for where he could feel the Jinchuriki hiding deep within the heart of it. The Jinchuriki began panicking, lashing out wildly and causing rifts to form in the earth around him that spewed lava in every direction. Still Kusha struck deeper, his Yuki ripping and tearing as he closed in. Finally, in desperation, the Jinchuriki released the construct completely, leaving them both to fall through the air as the energy keeping them suspended dispersed. The boy began gathering chakra to lash out directly, but found himself wrapped up in tails of chakra and drawn towards his attacker. Kusha paid no mind to the ninja's screams as his Yuki burned through his flesh like acid. He swiftly found the seal that was tattooed on the ninja's stomach and physically slammed his claws into it, digging into it and surrounding it with his Yuki. He found the edges of the seal that kept his brother bound and began pouring all the power he could into shattering it. It only lasted a few moments before it buckled under the pressure. With the seal broken, all of the power stored within was released in a massive shockwave that completed the destruction of the Jinchuriki and threw Kusha backwards to plow into the earth nearly a kilometer away. 3:30 am. 10 kilometers south of Iwagakure. What is that? Fast? Not our problem, Kisame grunted after a moment, turning to the red-haired teenager who was their target. Are you going to come quietly, or do I need to kick you around some more? He asked with a menacing leer. Gaara picked himself up off the ground, his movements slowly and unsteady. His face was twisted in anger as he stared at the 3 Akatsuki members who had surrounded him. Kisame hefted his sword, holding it out in front of him meaningfully. Well, you should listen to Kisame-dana, Deidara added with a grin. He's got this thing about cutting off people's legs, Gaara said slowly in a deep, rumbling voice that sent shivers down Fu's spine. I'm going to kill you. Then he collapsed into a pile of dirt and sand. All of them stared at the dirt for a moment, not quite comprehending what they were seeing. Then Kisame sprang forward, his sword whipping through the air over the remains of the clone. Fuck! He shouted angrily. How the fuck did that bastard get away? Deidara took off running in another direction, his own curses filling the air a moment later. The bitch is gone too, he called out. Kisame spent a few more seconds seething before he pulled himself together. We're done here, he ground out. He slammed his sword back into its holster on his back and began stalking away from the devastation left by the battle. Let's go. Kankuro swallowed thickly as he crouched next to Temari. Despite his roiling emotions, his hands were rock steady as they placed bandages over Temari's wounds. Gaara was standing nearby, his face completely blank and his eyes focused ahead. Only the slight grinding sound of the rocks sliding by and the barely felt vibration under his knees let him know that they were moving at all. According to Gaara, they were going to get help. He hoped so, he really did. Temari was still alive, still breathing, but she looked so fragile, lying there. She'd always seemed like a rock before, the anchor that somehow kept their family from drifting apart. It wasn't right to see her laid out on the ground so still, only the slight rise and fall of her chest showing that she still had life in her at all. Both of her arms were clearly broken, and her entire right side was bruising badly. He hadn't seen her legs move at all. Her breathing had also picked up an odd wheeze that scared him more than he thought possible. He wasn't a Mednin, but he knew that couldn't be good. Hurry, he said hoarsely, looking up at Gaara. Gaara didn't say anything, but his face tightened and the vibrations from underneath them grew in intensity. 3:30 a.m. 15 kilometers northeast of Iwagakure. Kusha pulled himself out of the ground, letting out a low growl as he shook off the dirt and looked to where the Jinchuriki had been. A swirling mass of dark red energy hung suspended in midair, pulsing slowly as it twisted on itself. Kusha could feel his brother clearly now, and a furious snarl tore its way out of his throat. His brother was still reeling from the sustained drain, weakened and disoriented as he tried to get his bearings. Kusha moved closer even as Akai began to drift towards him, his brother turning towards the familiar signature. Halfway there he stopped. There was someone closing in rapidly from the northeast, flying through the air far faster than any bird could hope to accomplish. It seemed to be heading for Akai, and Kusha moved to cut off the approaching ninja even as his brother drifted closer to the ground, the mass of Yuki slowly taking his usual shape of a four-tailed gorilla. There was a surge of chakra and a massive weight slammed onto his back, pinning him to the ground and trying to crush his body. He pushed himself to his feet, his body groaning in protest under the strain, only for the pressure to double in intensity. Even as that happened, Akai's Yuki was being drawn through the air against his will, swirling towards the ninja and then into a strange cube at the ninja's side. Kusha let out another roar and flared his Yuki, dispelling some of the pressure and gaining his feet once again. He was still struggling to move, however, and the ninja had managed to completely seal away Akai before he had managed 10 steps. He was not going to allow this to happen. Not now. Not after he'd finally come so close to truly freeing one of his brethren. Especially not when Akatsuki had found a way to greatly weaken them. It would take years for Akai to recover the power that had been stolen from him already. And no doubt this ninja was planning to place Akai within another container at the first opportunity. Bansho Tenin, a voice called out, ringing through the air. Kusha felt the chakra surrounding him more clearly now, and found himself rising into the air towards the ninja. His eyes narrowed as he studied the man who was doing this to him. He was wearing a black cloak adorned with stylized red clouds, the signature of Akatsuki. He had dark red hair and lightly tanned skin, but it was the eyes that jumped out at him. Even from this distance he could make out their purple color and ringed pupils. This was clearly a Dijitsu, though not one he had ever heard of. He came to a stop 30 meters away from the ninja, well outside of his known range. The implications of that were not lost on him. Naruto Yamanaka, the man called out, "Has your mind survived this transformation of yours?" Kusha remained silent. His eyes shifted to the large metal cube floating at the man's side. He could make out numerous eels covering its surface, no doubt an array meant to contain a bijou. "No matter," the man said after a moment. "Even if you have survived, your life was forfeit the moment you killed June." Yuki began flowing out of Kusha's body, filtering forward and gathering into a ball in front of him. "I am well aware of the limitations your seal imposes upon you, the man said calmly. Seeking to frighten me is useless. The ball seemed to shrink in on itself, dropping to half of its original size before growing once again as more Yuki flowed into it. They began moving through the air, flying to the east at a quick pace. The ball compressed once more, the color darkening. Even if this is some sort of suicide technique, you will not be able to harm me. Accept your death gracefully. The ball compressed again, and Kushu opened his mouth wide, stretching forward to enclose the ball within his jaws. Out of sight, the ball compressed even further, his Yuki pressing in on it from all sides. The man increased the distance between them to 50 meters, though his expression did not waver. With a sharp twist, Kushu detonated the hyper-compressed ball of Yuki, using the rest of his energy to channel the explosion in the direction he desired. He usually preferred not to use the Imari. It was far and away the most expensive use of their Yuki they had yet found, and it lacked any semblance of control or finesse. However, when it came to destroying anything and everything in his path, there was nothing better. The beam of annihilation lanced forward, the unique nature of the attack allowing it to maintain cohesion far beyond the limits imposed by his seal, and washed over the ninja, or where the ninja had been, Kushu noted in annoyance. Even as the technique that kept him suspended in the air failed, he could sense the ninja dropping towards the ground. In the last moments before Kushu unleashed the Imari, the ninja had abruptly released all of his techniques and flung himself towards the ground. He was annoyed that he had missed the ninja, but he was furious that he had also missed his true target, the cube that contained a Kai. The ninja landed on the ground lightly, his hands rising with one palm pointing towards the metal cube and the other towards himself. Then Kushu landed as well, and his claws dug into the ground as he flung himself towards the ninja. Shinra Tensei, the man barked. Kushu could feel the wave of force sweeping towards him, and his tails lanced forward even as his body was flung backwards. The ninja dodged, narrowly avoiding the streams of Yuki that threatened to impale him. Kushu slammed against a rock outcropping, but shook off the blow with ease as he charged forward once again, his tails spreading to attack the ninja from multiple directions at once. Fujitsu Kyuin, the man chanted as the tails closed in on him. Kushu's tails stabbed into his body, and were absorbed. He could feel the Yuki being stripped away from him, circulating inside the ninja's body and slowly converting into chakra. Even the Yuki around his body was being pulled him, the technique the ninja was using somehow preventing the damage that would normally occur. Your struggles are meaningless, the man said calmly as he stepped forward and made a sweeping motion with his free hand. This gathered the various tails into a single stream that fed into that arm, actually increasing the rate that he was pulling Yuki into his body. Even the Yuki of a Bijou cannot harm me. Surrendering your body to the beast within you has made you weaker, not stronger. Kushu paused, his eyes narrowed. Then he spoke for the first time since the man had shown up, his voice mocking. You really shouldn't have done that. He leapt backwards, covering dozens of meters in a matter of moments, and the seal kicked in. The Yuki still within the ninja's body was torn free, spraying blood across the clearing. The arm he had been using as the focal point for the technique was ripped apart, but there were still trace amounts of Yuki in other areas of his body that did their own damage. The ninja's shocked scream of pain and anger filled the air before he released a massive surge of power. Kushu's eyes widened as a shockwave that made the ninja's previous attacks seem like the playful taps of a child slammed into him, sending him rocketing backwards. His bones, strengthened though they were reduced to powder as his organs were pulped. He plowed through several rock outcroppings, the protruding rocks ripping into his hide and spilling his blood across the rocky plains. He eventually rolled to a stop nearly a kilometer away, his body unrecognizable as anything other than a pile of flesh and blood. He lay there for several seconds, stunned by the power of the assault, before he slowly began drawing himself together, blood flowing back into his body and bones reforming with cracks and snaps. He looked back to where the ninja had been, but could see nothing but a giant column of dust and smoke. He could feel one of the signatures he had sensed before, the one that had been flying, closing in rapidly towards the ninja's position. A deep growl left his throat. This ninja, whoever he was far too dangerous to let live. His powers were vastly different from that of any other ninja he'd seen, and the ability to absorb Yuki alone marked him for death. The flying ninja was near his attacker now, and they were slowly rising into the air once more, heading to the northeast. The cube that contained a Kai was moving with them, his claws scrabbled for purchase as he pursued the fleeing ninja. He didn't have time to prepare another menacing ball, so he would have to get physically close enough to bring his other techniques to bear. He finally caught sight of them. His attacker was being carried by a woman in an Akatsuki cloak with large white wings. The wings were natural, from what he could tell, and there was a great deal of chakra running through whatever substance the wings were made of. That same substance was wrapped around the cube and the ninja, supporting both of them with ease. The ninja Kushu had been fighting was bleeding profusely, and one arm was hanging at his side limply, testament to the damage his yuki had caused. He was still awake, however, and Kushu could see his head turning to follow his approach. Rocks tore themselves free of the ground and were flung into the sky as he closed in, but the woman with the wings dodged them easily, even gracefully, and the few that might have made it through were batted aside by white strands of something. The woman was gaining altitude rapidly, but she was still low enough to the ground that a powerful leap could bring him within range. He bounded to the top of the tallest outcropping nearby and launched himself forward, his yuki flaring as he boosted his muscles and manipulated the rock to essentially fling him into the sky towards the retreating pair. 80 meters. His eyes gleamed and his jaw dropped open to reveal his sharp fangs. 60 meters. The woman began flapping her wings even harder, her chakra flaring wildly as she reinforced them. She attempted to bank as well, but she wasn't going to be fast enough. 50 meters. The man raised his good arm, the movement lacking his previous grace. 40 meters. Kushu's tails were already lancing forward, crossing the remaining distance in the blink of an eye. The woman had no possible way to evade him. No. Shinra Tensei, the man coughed, his chakra flaring wildly again. Kushu let out another roar of frustration as he was flung away once again, his tails whipping through the air mere inches shy of impaling both of the infuriating ninja. The power behind this attack wasn't nearly as damaging as the last one, but it was more than enough to thwart his efforts, sending him sailing through the air far away from them. He controlled his descent this time, landing on his feet and already preparing to pursue them once again. They may be out of his reach now, but they would have to come back to the ground eventually. Another set of signatures intruded on his senses, moving underground and heading in his direction quickly: Ryudo, Gaara, Kankuro, and Temari. Temari's signature was disturbed, pulsing oddly and very faint. However, it didn't take much to understand what that likely meant. He stared after the retreating Akatsuki members, his muscles tensing, before he finally let out another low growl and turned to intercept the Suna team. 4:00 AM. 10 kilometers northeast of Iwagakure. Kankuro drew in a deep breath as Gaara finally returned them to the surface. It hadn't been difficult to breathe while in his underground bubble, exactly, but it had been a little stuffy all the same. His attention still remained focused on Temari, however, whose breathing was definitely starting to grow labored. Her skin was also very pale, despite the deep tan she had acquired over the last few months. He looked around, looking for the medical tent, or at least the mezzanine Gaara had brought them to. He didn't see anything, though, just more of the rocky terrain, although this piece did seem a little more broken and blasted than the rest. "Gaara, where are we? Why did you bring us here?" he asked, his voice rising. "We need to get help for Temari." Help is here," Gaara said calmly, his gaze focused into the distance. His eyes suddenly widened and he took a half a step back before he could stop himself. His arms nearly left their position across his chest before he slowly relaxed and resumed his previous posture. Kankuro turned to look at what he was reacting to just in time for the large thing to land less than a meter away with an audible thump, its large, razor-sharp claws digging through solid rock as it brought itself to a halt. It looked like someone had taken a fox, made it the size of a tiger, and dyed its fur blood red. He felt his entire body tensing as his instincts screamed at him to run, but he found himself unable to move as its presence washed over him. It was the heaviest, most dangerous sensation he had ever encountered in his life, feeling simultaneously like the largest chakra technique he had ever witnessed being unleashed all around him and the focused killing intent of 100 ninja boring into his soul. Worst of all, the thing wasn't even looking at him. All of its attention was focused on Temari, and even as he watched 2 of its 9 tails whipped forward and into her body. Her back arched upwards and her eyes flew open as her mouth opened in a soundless scream. He found himself moving before his mind even finished processing the fact that he was about to die horribly. 2 kunai flew through the air towards the thing's head, followed by his puppet. The kunai were batted aside with the flick of a third tail, and his puppet was tossed aside just as easily. The chakra strings he had connected to it snapped completely by a fourth. A fifth lanced towards him, and he felt himself tumbling through the air to land with several meters away, the air pushed out of his lungs. "Sit!" came the rumbling sound from the fox-like creature, though its mouth didn't seem to move. His mind finally started catching up with what was going on, and he saw Gaara standing next to the thing, watching sharply as Temari fell back on the ground, her eyes still wide open and staring up at the head of the creature looming over her. Her jaw continued to work, but no sound emerged. The tableau remained the same for nearly a minute before the tails abruptly withdrew from Temari and the creature backed off a few steps before settling onto its haunches, the tails fanning out behind it and idly curling through the air. Temari's eyes remained locked on the animal as she slowly sat up, her hands reaching up to feel her face and head. She swallowed thickly and her eyes darted at Gaara for a moment before she spoke. Naruto? She asked, her voice quavering. The beast turned to look at Gaara for a moment, then back to Temari. How much has Gaara told you? Temari flinched at the sound of the beast's voice, but managed to respond. That he could talk to the tail be the bija sealed inside of him, and that they weren't the mindless beasts everyone said. And that you could do the same. The creature let out a sharp snort and shook its head. If I wished to talk to myself, I suppose I could. Kankuro felt his heart pounding. Why you mean that Naruto is? Naruto never was, really. Unlike Gaara, that child did not survive the sealing. I have been forced to make do ever since that day. Kankuro and Temari both turned to look at Gaara, who just gave a small shrug and a nod. I knew, he said quietly. They both nodded dumbly as they looked between their brother and the Kyuubi made flesh. Temari sucked in a deep breath, her eyes widening. What about Ino? She asked suddenly. Does she? She cut off as the Kyuubi began laughing to itself, the sound sending a shudder down their spines. Ino knows, it said, more than anyone. Its head turned back to Gaara. How did this happen anyway? I would have thought you would never have allowed things to come to this point. It was Akatsuki, Gaara said, his face darkening. 3 of them, though I only fought one directly. There was a blond man riding a bird of some kind, Temari volunteered. He could create smaller birds and spiders that would explode. Deidara, missing Nin from IWA, the Kyuubi said, nodding. I had not known he had joined Akatsuki, however. I was winning against him, Temari continued, a scowl growing on her face. I would have killed him myself if I hadn't been attacked from behind. I didn't get a good look at who it was, but I think it was a female, and I definitely saw the 6 green wings she was using to fly. Temari was interrupted again as the Kyuubi's presence flared and a menacing growl escaped its throat. It snarled, its lips bared to reveal a mouth full of sharp fangs. Jinchuriki of Siyu. To think that I was going to allow her to live. Temari nodded uncertainly. She hit me from behind, throwing me off of my fan and leaving me to fall. I barely managed to slow down enough to survive. She looked uncomfortable for a moment. Thank you for healing me, she said finally. How bad was it? Several of your ribs had shattered and punctured your left lung, the Kyuubi stated, its tone even. Even assuming you had managed to survive that, your spine was broken in 3 places. Without prompt and extensive surgery you likely would have remained paralyzed. Oh, Temari said faintly, her face pale. She fell silent after that, her eyes slightly wild as she processed just how close she had come to dying. The other was a tall, blue man, a missing Nin from Kiri, Gaara said after a moment. Kankuro didn't know if it was intentional or not, but he was grateful for the change in topic. That would be Kisame Hashigaki, one of the few members of Akatsuki we have managed to confirm. Kankuro startled slightly at that, though he didn't say anything. He didn't know who the Kyuubi was referring to with that, but he got the distinct impression that it wasn't Konoha, or Gaara for that matter. He is strong, Gaara said flatly. His sword has the ability to absorb both chakra and yuki, and he can use that to fuel his own techniques. He was also able to cleave through Ryuto's form with that same blade. The Kyuubi's eyes narrowed, though it didn't growl again. Another one, it said. It didn't explain what it meant, however. Next time, Gaara said, a sadistic grin spreading across his face, I will crush him. Further discussion was halted when the ground began rumbling under their feet. The Kyuubi looked to Gaara, its head cocked to the side, but Gaara's gaze was focused to the southwest. That is not us, the redhead said after a moment. It is happening far away, in IWA-3:50 AM. Iwagakure, Tsuchikage Tower. I wondered how long it would take you to get here, Sarutobi, the Tsuchikage said calmly. He was standing on the roof of the tallest building in Iwagakure, his back slightly hunched as he gazed out over his village. Oenoki, the former Hokage, growled softly as he landed on the roof. Your pride has brought us to war for the last time. He was covered head to toe in black and wore an old-fashioned helm on his head. He had a large staff clutched in his hands, both ends of which were already stained with blood. Oenoki just chuckled, turning to face his fellow Kage on the roof of the tower they were standing on. My pride, Sarutobi? I have done what I must to protect my village and its people, as I always have. The old man straightened, a tightly controlled grimace crossing his face for a moment, as he drew himself up to his full height. Let us instead speak of your pride, which led your village to delude itself into thinking that it could not possibly be deceived or misled. Assuming this entire situation wasn't Konoha's plan to begin with. Even now you persist? Sarutobi asked, his eyes narrowed. We gave you every chance to prove your Inik. You gave us every chance to destroy ourselves. Oenoki snarled, one hand slashing through the air angrily. Allow the other villages to scout every nook and cranny of our territory? Allow a Hyuga inside our very village to ferret out our greatest secrets? Do you take me for a fool, Sarutobi? Whatever secrets you might have lost would be better than this. Sarutobi countered, gesturing around to the village. The sounds of fighting were growing closer, the screams of dying ninja and the echoes of hundreds of ninjutsu underscoring their conversation. Your refusal to compromise has cost the lives of more ninja than losing your damn secrets ever could. That is why Konoha will never achieve true greatness, Sarutobi. You lose a few leaves and you fear the tree will wither and die. Pathetic. That is why the will of stone will triumph in the end. Leaves fall to the ground and rot, useless and meaningless, and are gone in the blink of an eye. The stone endures. Oenoki's feet left the ground as he slowly rose into the air. His arms were held at his sides, his hands clenched into fists. Their eyes met, and neither moved for several long seconds. You can still surrender, Sarutobi said quietly, even as he raised his staff before him and crouched low. The stone never yields, Hiruzen. The silence held for several seconds. Then Oenoki raised his hands before him, holding them roughly a foot apart as his face narrowed in concentration. Sarutobi exploded into motion, his staff spinning and dancing from one hand to another as he launched several kunai towards the floating Oenoki. The Tsuchikage dodged to the side, his movements flowing and graceful as he shifted through the air. His eyes widened slightly when the kunai suddenly multiplied in midair, and he was forced to drop his hands and focus on evading the weapons as quickly as he could. He ended up using the tower itself as a shield, dropping below the roofline as more projectiles were launched in his direction and were rapidly duplicated. You're too slow, Oenoki, Sarutobi called out mockingly. He launched himself off the side of the tower towards Oenoki, his staff blurring as it jabbed and swiped. Oenoki twisted in midair, narrowly avoiding the strikes as he used his maneuverability to his advantage. He grinned and raised his hands again, taking the time while Sarutobi was still in the air between the tower and the closest building to prepare his attack. His eyes widened as a massive surge of chakra appeared behind him. He attempted to flee upwards even as he turned and saw some sort of combination wind-fire technique blasting out of the side of his tower and threatening to engulf him. Another wind technique cut him off and forced him downwards, the blades of air leaving shallow cuts along his arm and back. That wind technique hit the brewing firestorm as well, feeding the flames until it seemed the sky itself was burning. Deciding that his current approach was not going to work, he abruptly changed directions and slammed into the side of the tower, smashing through the stone walls even as he avoided another of Sarutobi's attacks. The former Hokage's eyes narrowed as he saw the Tsuchikage vanish into the tower. He remained in motion, darting from building to building and sending blades of wind and plumes of fire into the tower even as he watched for the next attack. It came just as he leapt the narrow gap between buildings. The side of the tower seemed to rip itself free and lance through the air towards him. He met the attack with his staff, using the weapon to absorb the blow, and using the momentum to change his course in midair. His staff seemed to sink into the rock slightly, and his eyes narrowed as the projectile was revealed to be a golem. One rocky hand already wrapped around the other end of his staff, and the other was swinging towards him to deliver a powerful blow even as the golem itself slammed into the roof of the building. He spun himself around the staff, his agile body slipping between the golem's arms and avoiding the attack completely. One hand slapped the construct near where it was holding the end of his staff, and the golem began to collapse, its body shedding layers and revealing it to be an amalgamation of numerous smaller slabs of stone likely drawn from the tower itself. He looked up to see Oenoki hovering nearby, both hands raised in front of him about a foot apart. His hands were cradling a brightly glowing white ball that was surrounded by a thin, translucent cube. At the same time Oenoki pushed his hands outward as if shoving something forward, Sarutobi launched his staff through the air like a spear. The cube rapidly expanded as it rushed towards Sarutobi, and the staff passed through the translucent walls without any effect. A moment later, the cube had completely surrounded Sarutobi, leaving him staring at the white ball. Oenoki shifted slightly to the side to avoid the spear, the last-ditch attack passing him by harmlessly. He allowed himself a grim smile as he activated the technique, and the white ball suddenly exploded, filling the cube and completely obliterating everything inside of it. He felt the hammer blow at the base of his spine before he even registered the slight pop from behind him, or saw the thin stream of smoke wafting through the air. His eyes widened in shock and his mouth opened in a silent scream of pain as the blow launched him forward to slam into a nearby roof. He rolled to a stop on his back, and he instinctively sought out his attacker. His eyes widened in disbelief when he saw Sarutobi clinging to the side of the building. The Tsuchikage raised his hands in front of him, shoving aside the agony and the growing numbness to focus on his dust release once more. The former Hokage was at his side a moment later, batting his arms aside and breaking the technique once again. Onoki's face twisted into a ghastly grin. God of Shinobi, indeed, he wheezed. To lose, to the Kawarini, of all things. Rest in peace, Onoki, Sarutobi said quietly as he pulled out a kunai. I never wanted things to end this way, Sarutobi, Onoki said lowly, his grin widening. Wither, and die. He maintained his grin even as the kunai flashed through the air and ended his life. Sarutobi remained wary. His eyes narrowed as he scanned his surroundings and watched for any signs of traps or ambushes. There was no buildup of chakra to reveal some sort of dead man's switch technique, nor did he sense any ninja in the immediate vicinity. He sealed Onoki's body away, then knelt and rapidly flashed through hand signs as he performed the summoning technique. With a puff of smoke, Enma appeared before him once again. That is a most unpleasant way to die, Hiruzen, Enma said, his fur-covered face twisted into a sour expression. My apologies, old friend, but you weathered it much better than I would have. Indeed, Enma agreed, his lips quirking. With a nod, he transformed into a staff once again, and Sarutobi picked it up and prepared to rejoin the battle. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he sensed a rapidly growing concentration of chakra from all around him. He couldn't identify a single source. In fact, it felt like the entire village was being flooded. The concentration peaked after a few seconds, then seemed to drain out and away without any visible effect. He wasn't foolish enough to believe that nothing had happened or would happen, though, and he quickly doubled his pace as he moved to meet up with the nearest group of Konoha ninja. Then the mountains that loomed over Iwagakure exploded,